This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Caitlin Sticko, Madison, Wisconsin, 2007. Captain Blood by Rafael Sabatini. Chapter 9. The Rebel's Convict. There were, when the purple gloom of the tropical night descended upon the Caribbean, not more than 10 men on guard aboard the Cinco Llagas, so confident, and with good reason, were the Spaniards of the complete subjection of the islanders. And when I say that there were 10 men on guard, I state rather the purpose for which they were left aboard than the duty which they fulfilled. As a matter of fact, whilst the main body of the Spaniards feasted and rioted ashore, the Spanish gunner and his crew, who had so nobly done their duty and ensured the easy victory of the day, were feasting on the gun deck upon the wine and the fresh meats fetched out to them from shore. Above, 2 sentinels only kept vigil, at stem and stern, nor were they as vigilant as they should have been, or else they must have observed the 2 wherries that under cover of the darkness came gliding from the wharf with well-greased rowlocks to bring up in silence under the great ship's quarter. From the gallery aft still hung the ladder by which Don Diego had descended to the boat that had taken him ashore. The sentry on guard in the stern, coming presently round this gallery, was suddenly confronted by the black shadow of a man standing before him at the head of the ladder. "Who's there?" he asked, but without alarm, supposing it was one of his fellows. "It is I," softly answered Peter Blood, in the fluent Castilian of which he was master. "Is it you, Pedro?" The Spaniard came a step nearer. "Peter is my name, but I doubt I'll not be the Peter you're expecting." "How?" quoth the sentry, checking. "This way," said Mr. Blood. The wooden taffrail was a low one, and the Spaniard was taken completely by surprise. Save for the splash he made as he struck the water, narrowly missing one of the crowded boats that waited under the counter, not a sound announced his misadventure. Armed as he was with corselet, cuissarts, and headpiece, he sank to trouble them no more. "Whist!" hissed Mr. Blood to his waiting rebels convict. "Come on now, and without noise." Within 5 minutes they had swarmed aboard, the entire 20 of them overflowing from that narrow gallery and crouching on the quarter-deck itself. Lights showed ahead. Under the great lantern in the prow they saw the black figure of the other sentry pacing on the forecastle. From below sounds reached them of the orgy on the gun-deck. A rich male voice was singing an obscene ballad, to which the others chanted in chorus, "Y estos son los usos de Castilla y de Leon." "From what I have seen today, I can well believe it," said Mr. Blood, and whispered, "Forward, after me." Crouching low, they glided, noiseless as shadows, to the quarter-deck rail, and thence slipped without sound down into the waist. 2/3 of them were armed with muskets, some of which they had found in the overseer's house, and others supplied from the secret hoard that Mr. Blood had so laboriously assembled against the day of escape. The remainder were equipped with knives and cutlasses. In the vessel's waist they hung awhile, until Mr. Blood had satisfied himself that no other sentinel showed above decks but that inconvenient fellow in the prow. Their first attention must be for him. Mr. Blood himself crept forward with 2 companions, leaving the others in charge of that Nathaniel Hagthorpe whose sometime commission in the King's Navy gave him the best title to this office. Mr. Blood's absence was brief. When he rejoined his comrades, there was no watch above the Spaniards' decks. Meanwhile, the revellers below continued to make merry at their ease in the conviction of complete security. The garrison of Barbados was overpowered and disarmed, and their companions were ashore in complete possession of the town, glutting themselves hideously upon the fruits of victory. What then was there to fear? Even when their quarters were invaded, and they found themselves surrounded by a score of wild, hairy, half-naked men, who, save that they appeared once to have been white, looked like a horde of savages, the Spaniards could not believe their eyes. Who could have dreamed that a handful of forgotten plantation slaves would have dared to take so much upon themselves? The half-drunk Spaniards, their laughter suddenly quenched, the song perishing on their lips, stared, stricken and bewildered, at the levelled muskets by which they were checkmated. And then, from out of this uncouth pack of savages that beset them, stepped a slim, tall fellow with light blue eyes and a tawny face, eyes which glinted the light of a wicked humour. He addressed them in the purest Castilian. "You'll save yourselves pain and trouble by regarding yourselves my prisoners, and suffering yourselves to be quietly bestowed out of harm's way." "Name of God!" swore the gunner, who did no justice at all to an amazement beyond expression. "If you please," said Mr. Blood, and thereupon these gentlemen of Spain were induced without further trouble beyond a musket prod or two to drop through a scuttle to the deck below. After that the rebels-convict refreshed themselves with the good things in the consumption of which they had interrupted the Spaniards. To taste palatable Christian food after months of salt fish and maize dumplings was in itself a feast to these unfortunates. But there were no excesses. Mr. Blood saw to that, although it required all the firmness of which he was capable. Dispositions were to be made without delay against that which must follow before they could abandon themselves fully to the enjoyment of their victory. This, after all, was no more than a preliminary skirmish, although it was one that afforded them the key to the situation. It remained to dispose so that the utmost profit might be drawn from it. Those dispositions occupied some very considerable portion of the night, but at least they were complete before the sun peeped over the shoulder of Mount Hilibay to shed his light upon the day of some surprises. It was soon after sunrise that the rebel-convict who paced the quarter-deck in Spanish corsetlet and headpiece, a Spanish musket on his shoulder, announced the approach of a boat. It was Don Diego de Espinosa y Valdez coming aboard with 4 great treasure chests, containing each 25,000 pieces of 8, the ransom delivered to him at dawn by Governor Steed. He was accompanied by his son, Don Esteban, and 6 men who took the oars. Aboard the frigate all was quiet and orderly, as it should be. She rode at anchor, her larboard to the shore, and the main ladder on her starboard side. Round to this came the boat with Don Diego and his treasure. Mr. Blood had disposed effectively. It was not for nothing that he had served under de Ruyter. The swings were waiting, and the windlass manned. Below, a gun crew held itself in readiness under the command of Ogle, who, as I have said, had been a gunner in the Royal Navy before he went in for politics and followed the fortunes of the Duke of Monmouth. He was a sturdy, resolute fellow, who inspired confidence by the very confidence he displayed in himself. Don Diego mounted the ladder and stepped upon the deck, alone and entirely unsuspicious. What should the poor man suspect? Before he could even look round and survey this guard drawn up to him, a tap over the head with a capstan bar efficiently handled by Hagthorpe put him to sleep without the least fuss. He was carried away to his cabin, whilst the treasure chests, handled by the men he had left in the boat, were being hauled to the deck. That being satisfactorily accomplished, Don Esteban and the fellows who manned the boat came up the ladder, one by one, to be handled with the same quiet efficiency. Peter Blood had a genius for these things, and almost, I suspect, an eye for the dramatic. Dramatic, certainly, was the spectacle now offered to the survivors of the raid. With Colonel Bishop at their head, and gout-ridden Governor Steed sitting on the ruins of a wall beside him, they glumly watched the departure of the 8 boats containing the weary Spanish ruffians who had glutted themselves with rapine, murder, and violences unspeakable. They looked on, between relief at this departure of their remorseless enemies, and despair at the wild ravages which, temporarily at least, had wrecked the prosperity and happiness of their little colony. The boats pulled away from the shore, with loads of laughing, jeering Spaniards, who were still flinging taunts across the water at their surviving victims. They had come midway between the wharf and the ship, when suddenly the air was shaken by the boom of a gun. A round shot struck the water within a fathom of the foremost boat, sending a shower of spray over its occupants. They paused at their oars, astounded into silence for a moment. Then speech burst from them like an explosion. Angrily voluble, they anathematized this dangerous carelessness on the part of their gunner, who should know better than to fire a salute from a cannon loaded with shot. They were still cursing him, when a second shot, better aimed than the first, came to crumple one of the boats into splinters, flinging its crew, dead and living, into the water. But if it silenced these, it gave tongue, still more angry, vehement, and bewildered, to the crews of the other 7 boats. From each the suspended oars stood out, poised over the water, whilst on their feet in the excitement the Spaniards screamed oaths at the ship, begging heaven and hell to inform them what madman had been let loose among her guns. Plump into their middle came a third shot, smashing a second boat with fearful execution. Followed again a moment of awful silence. And then, among these Spanish pirates, all was gibbering and jabbering and splashing at oars, as they attempted to pull in every direction at once. Some were for going ashore, others for heading straight to the vessel, and there discovering what might be amiss. That something was very gravely amiss, there could be no further doubt, particularly as whilst they discussed and fumed and cursed, 2 more shots came over the water to account for yet a third of their boats. The resolute Ogle was making excellent practice, and fully justifying his claims to know something of gunnery. In their consternation the Spaniards had simplified his task by huddling their boats together. After the 4th shot, opinion was no longer divided amongst them. As with one accord they went about, or attempted to do so, for before they had accomplished it, 2 more of their boats had been sunk. The 3 boats that remained, without concerning themselves with their more unfortunate fellows who were struggling in the water, headed back for the wharf at speed. If the Spaniards understood nothing of all this, the forlorn islanders ashore understood still less, until, to help their wits, they saw the flag of Spain come down from the mainmast of the Cinco Llagas, and the flag of England soar into its empty place. Even then some bewilderment persisted, and it was with fearful eyes that they observed the return of their enemies, who might vent upon them the ferocity aroused by these extraordinary events. Ogle, however, continued to give proof that his knowledge of gunnery was not of yesterday. After the fleeing Spaniards went his shots. The last of their boats flew into splinters as it touched the wharf, and its remains were buried under a shower of loosened masonry. That was the end of this pirate crew, which not 10 minutes ago had been laughingly counting up the pieces of 8 that would fall to the portion for each for his share in that act of villainy. Close upon 70 survivors contrived to reach the shore. Whether they had cause for congratulation, I am unable to say in the absence of any records in which their fate may be traced. That lack of records is in itself eloquent. We know that they were made fast as they landed, and considering the offence they had given, I am not disposed to doubt that they had every reason to regret the survival. The mystery of the succour that had come at the 11th hour to wreak vengeance upon the Spaniards, and to preserve for the island the extortionate ransom of 100,000 pieces of 8, remained yet to be probed. That the Cinco Llagas was now in friendly hands could no longer be doubted after the proofs it had given. But who, the people of Bridgetown asked one another, were the men in possession of her, and whence had they come? The only possible assumption ran the truth very closely. A resolute party of islanders must have got aboard during the night and seized the ship. It remained to ascertain the precise identity of these mysterious saviours, and do them fitting honour. Upon this errand, Governor Steed's condition not permitting him to go in person, went Colonel Bishop as the governor's deputy, attended by 2 officers. As he stepped from the ladder into the vessel's waist, the colonel beheld there, beside the main hatch, the 4 treasure chests, the contents of one of which had been contributed almost entirely by himself. It was a gladsome spectacle, and his eyes sparkled in beholding it. Ranged on either side, athwart the deck, stood a score of men in 2 well-ordered files, with breasts and backs of steel, polished Spanish morions on their heads, overshadowing their faces, and muskets ordered at their sides. Colonel Bishop could not be expected to recognise at a glance in these upright, furbished, soldierly figures the ragged, unkempt scarecrows that but yesterday had been toiling in his plantations. Still less could he be expected to recognise at once the courtly gentleman who advanced to greet him, a lean, graceful gentleman, dressed in the Spanish fashion, all in black with silver lace, a gold-hilted sword dangling beside him from a gold-embroidered baldric, a broad castor with a sweeping plume set above carefully curled ringlets of deepest black. "Be welcome aboard the Cinco Llagas, Colonel Darling," a voice vaguely familiar addressed the planter. "We've made the best of the Spaniard's wardrobe in honour of this visit, though it was scarcely yourself we had dared hope to expect. You find yourself among friends. Old friends of yours all." The colonel stared in stupefaction. Mr. Blood, tricked out in all this splendour, indulging therein his natural taste, his face carefully shaven, his hair as carefully dressed, seemed transformed into a younger man. The fact is, he looked no more than the 33 years he had counted to his age. "Peter Blood!" It was an ejaculation of amazement. Satisfaction followed swiftly. "Was it you, then?" "Myself it was. Myself and these, my good friends and yours." Mr. Blood tossed back the fine lace from his wrist to wave a hand toward the file of men standing to attention there. The colonel looked more closely. "Gad's my life!" he crowed on a note of foolish jubilation. "And it was with these fellows that you took the Spaniard and turned the tables on those dogs? Odds wounds! It was heroic!" "Heroic, is it? Bedad, it's epic! You begin to perceive the breadth and depth of my genius." Colonel Bishop sat himself down on the hatch coaming, took off his broad hat, and mopped his brow. "You amaze me!" he gasped. "On my soul, you amaze me! To have recovered the treasure, and to have seized this fine ship and all she'll hold, it will be something to set against the other losses we have suffered. As gad's my life, you deserve well for this." "I am entirely of your opinion." "Damn! You all deserve well, and damn you shall find me grateful." "That's as it should be," said Mr. Blood. "The question is how well we deserve, and how grateful shall we find you?" Colonel Bishop considered him. There was a shadow of surprise in his face. "Why, His Excellency shall write home an account of your exploit, and maybe some portion of your sentences shall be remitted." "The generosity of King James is well known," sneered Nathaniel Hagthorpe, who was standing by, and amongst the ranged rebels-convict someone ventured to laugh. Colonel Bishop started up. He was pervaded by the first pang of uneasiness. It occurred to him that all here might not be as friendly as appeared. "And there's another matter," Mr. Blood resumed. "There's a matter of a flogging that's due to me. You're a man of your word in such matters, Colonel, if not perhaps in others, and you said, I think, that you'd not leave a square inch of skin on my back." The planter waved the matter aside. Almost it seemed to offend him. "Tush, tush! After this splendid deed of yours, do you suppose I can be thinking of such things?" "I'm glad you feel like that about it. But I'm thinking it's mighty lucky for me the Spaniards didn't come today instead of yesterday, or it's in the same plight as Jeremy Pitt I'd be this minute. In that case, where was the genius that would have turned the tables on these rascally Spaniards?" "Why speak of it now?" Mr. Blood resumed. "You'll please to understand that I must, Colonel, darling. You've worked a deal of wickedness and cruelty in your time, and I want this to be a lesson to you, a lesson that you'll remember, for the sake of others who may come after us. There's Jeremy, up there in the roundhouse, with a back that's every colour of the rainbow, and the poor lad'll not be himself again for a month. And if it hadn't been for the Spaniards, maybe it's dead he'd be by now, and maybe myself with him." Hagthorpe lounged forward. He was a fairly tall, vigorous man with a clear-cut, attractive face, which in itself announced his breeding. "Why will you be wasting words on the hog?" wondered that sometime officer of the Royal Navy. "Fling him overboard and have done with him." The Colonel's eyes bulged in his head. "What the devil do you mean?" he blustered. "It's the lucky man you are entirely, Colonel, though you don't guess the source of your good fortune." And now another intervened, the brawny, one-eyed Wolverstone, less mercifully disposed than his more gentlemanly fellow-convicts. "String him up from the yard-arm!" he cried, his deep voice harsh and angry, and more than one of the slaves standing to their arms made echo. Colonel Bishop trembled. Mr. Blood turned. He was quite calm. "If you please, Wolverstone," said he, "I conduct affairs in my own way. This is the pact. You'll please to remember it." His eyes looked along the ranks, making it plain that he addressed them all. "I desire that Colonel Bishop should have his life. One reason is that I require him as a hostage. If you insist on hanging him, you'll have to hang me with him, or in the alternative I'll go ashore." He paused. There was no answer, but they stood hangdog and half mutinous before him, save Hagthorpe, who shrugged and smiled wearily. Mr. Blood resumed. "You'll please to understand that aboard a ship there's one captain. So," he swung again to the startled Colonel, "though I promise you your life, I must, as you've heard, keep you aboard as a hostage for the good behaviour of Governor Steed and what's left of the fort until we put to sea." "Until you..." Horror prevented Colonel Bishop from echoing the remainder of that incredible speech. "Just so," said Peter Blood, and he turned to the officers who had accompanied the Colonel. "The boat is waiting, gentlemen. You'll have heard what I said. Convey it with my compliments to His Excellency." "But, sir," one of them began. "There is no more to be said, gentlemen. My name is Blood, Captain Blood, if you please, of this ship, the Cinco Llagas, taken as a prize of war from Don Diego de Espinosa y Valdez, who is my prisoner aboard. You are to understand that I have turned the tables on more than the Spaniards. There's the ladder. You'll find it more convenient than being heaved over the side, which is what'll happen if you linger." They went, though not without some hustling, regardless of the bellowings of Colonel Bishop, whose monstrous rage was fanned by terror at finding himself at the mercy of these men, of whose cause to hate him he was very fully conscious. A half-dozen of them, apart from Jeremy Pitt, who was utterly incapacitated for the present, possessed a superficial knowledge of seamanship. Hagthorpe, although he had been a fighting officer, untrained in navigation, knew how to handle a ship, and under his directions they set about getting under way. The anchor catted, and the mainsail unfurled, they stood out for the open before a gentle breeze, without interference from the fort. As they were returning close to the headland east of the bay, Peter Blood returned to the Colonel, who, under guard and panic-stricken, had dejectedly resumed his seat on the coamings of the main batch. "Can you swim, Colonel?" Colonel Bishop looked up. His great face was yellow, and seemed in that moment of a preternatural flabbiness. His beady eyes were beadier than ever. "As your doctor now, I prescribe a swim to cool the excessive heat of your humours." Blood delivered the explanation pleasantly, and receiving still no answer from the Colonel, continued, "It's a mercy for you I'm not by nature as bloodthirsty as some of my friends here, and it's the devil's own labour I've had to prevail upon them not to be vindictive. I doubt if you're worth the pains I've taken for you." He was lying. He had no doubt at all. He had followed his own wishes and instincts, and he would certainly have strung the Colonel up and accounted it a meritorious deed. It was the thought of Arabella Bishop that had urged him to mercy, and had led him to oppose the natural vindictiveness of his fellow slaves until he had been in danger of precipitating a mutiny. It was entirely to the fact that the Colonel was her uncle, although he did not even begin to suspect such a cause, that he owed such mercy as was now being shown him. "You'll have a chance to swim for it," Peter Blood continued. "It's not above 1/4 of a mile to the headland yonder, and with ordinary luck you should manage it. Faith, you're fat enough to float. Come on, now don't be hesitating, or it's a long voyage you'll be going with us, and the devil knows what may happen to you. You're not loved any more than you deserve." Colonel Bishop mastered himself and rose. A merciless despot, who had never known the need for restraint in all these years, he was doomed by ironic fate to practice restraint in the very moment when his feelings had reached their most violent intensity. Peter Blood gave an order. A plank was run over the gunwale and lashed down. "If you please, Colonel," said he, with a graceful flourish of invitation. The Colonel looked at him, and there was hell in his glance. Then, taking his resolve and putting the best face upon it, since no other could help him here, he kicked off his shoes, peeled off his fine coat of biscuit-coloured taffetas, and climbed upon the plank. A moment he paused, steadied by a hand that clutched the ratlines, looking down in terror at the green water rushing past some 25 feet below. "Just take a little walk, Colonel darling," said a smooth, mocking voice behind him. Still clinging, Colonel Bishop looked round in hesitation and saw the bulwarks lined with swarthy faces, the faces of men that as lately as yesterday would have turned pale under his frown, faces that were now all wickedly agrin. For a moment rage stamped out his fear. He cursed them aloud, venomously and incoherently, then loosened his hold and stepped out upon the plank. 3 steps he took before he lost his balance and went tumbling into the green depths below. When he came to the surface again, gasping for air, the Cinco Llagas was already some furlongs to leeward. But the roaring cheer of the mocking valediction from the rebels convict reached him across the water to drive the iron of impotent rage deeper into his soul. End of chapter 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Caitlin Sticco, Madison, Wisconsin, 2007. Captain Blood by Rafael Sabatini. Chapter 10. Don Diego. Don Diego de Espinosa y Valdez awoke, and with languid eyes and aching head he looked round the cabin, which was flooded with sunlight from the square windows astern. Then he uttered a moan and closed his eyes again, impelled to this by the monstrous ache in his head. Lying thus, he attempted to think, to locate himself in time and space, but between the pain in his head and the confusion in his mind, he found coherent thought impossible. An indefinite sense of alarm drove him to open his eyes again, and once more to consider his surroundings. There could be no doubt that he lay in the great cabin of his own ship, the Cinco Llagas, so his vague disquiet must be, surely, ill-founded. And yet stirrings of memory, coming now to the assistance of reflection, compelled him uneasily to insist that here something was not as it should be. The low position of the sun, flooding the cabin with golden light from those square ports astern, suggested to him at first that it was early morning, on the assumption that the vessel was headed westward. Then the alternative occurred to him. They might be sailing eastward, in which case the time of day would be late afternoon. That they were sailing he could feel from the gentle forward heave of the vessel under him. But how did they come to be sailing, and he, the master, not know whether their course lay east or west, not be able to recollect whither they were bound? His mind went back over the adventure of yesterday. If of yesterday it was, He was clear on the matter of the easily successful raid upon the island of Barbados. Every detail stood vividly in his memory up to the moment at which, returning aboard, he had stepped onto his own deck again. There memory abruptly and inexplicably ceased. He was beginning to torture his mind with conjecture when the door opened, and to Don Diego's increasing mystification, he beheld his best suit of clothes step into the cabin. It was a singularly elegant and characteristically Spanish suit of black taffetas with silver lace that had been made for him a year ago in Cadiz, and he knew each detail of it so well that it was impossible he could now be mistaken. The suit paused to close the door, then advanced towards the couch on which Don Diego was extended, and inside the suit came a tall, slender gentleman of about Don Diego's own height and shape. Seeing the wide, startled eyes of the Spaniard upon him, the gentleman lengthened his stride. "Awake, eh?" he said in Spanish. The recumbent man looked bewildered into a pair of light blue eyes that regarded him out of a tawny, sardonic face set in a cluster of black ringlets, but he was too bewildered to make any answer. The stranger's fingers touched the top of Don Diego's head, whereupon Don Diego winced and cried out in pain. "Tender, eh?" said the stranger. He took Don Diego's wrist between thumb and second finger, and then, at last, the intrigued Spaniard spoke. "Are you a doctor?" "Among other things." The swarthy gentleman continued his study of the patient's pulse. "Ferment regular," he announced at last, and dropped the wrist. "You've taken no great harm." Don Diego struggled up into a sitting position on the red velvet couch. "Who the devil are you?" he asked. "And what the devil are you doing in my clothes and aboard my ship?" The long black eyebrows went up. A faint smile curled the lips of the long mouth. "You are still delirious, I fear. This is not your ship. This is my ship, and these are my clothes." "Your ship?" quoth the other, aghast, and still more aghast he added, "Your clothes? But, then—" Wildly his eyes looked about him. They scanned the cabin once again, scrutinizing each familiar object. "Am I mad?" he asked at last. "Surely this ship is the Cinco Llagas." "The Cinco Llagas it is." "Then—" The Spaniard broke off. His glance grew still more troubled. "Válgame Dios!" he cried, like a man in anguish. "Will you tell me also that you are Don Diego de Espinosa?" "Oh, no. My name is Blood. Captain Peter Blood. This ship, like this handsome suit of clothes, is mine by right of conquest, just as you, Don Diego, are my prisoner." Startling as was the explanation, yet it proved soothing to Don Diego, being so much less startling than the things he was beginning to imagine. "But are you not Spanish, then?" "You flatter my Castilian accent. I have the honour to be Irish. You are thinking that a miracle has happened. So it has. A miracle wrought by my genius, which is considerable." Succinctly now Captain Blood dispelled the mystery by a relation of the facts. It was a narrative that painted red and white by turns the Spaniard's countenance. He put a hand to the back of his head, and there discovered, in confirmation of the story, a lump as large as a pigeon's egg. Lastly, he stared wild-eyed at the sardonic Captain Blood. "And my son? What of my son?" he cried out. "He was in the boat that brought me aboard." "Your son is safe. He and the boat's crew, together with your gunner and his men, are snugly in irons under hatches." Don Diego sank back on the couch, his glittering dark eyes fixed upon the tawny face above him. He composed himself. After all, he possessed the stoicism proper to his desperate trade. The dice had fallen against him in this venture. The tables had been turned upon him in the very moment of success. He accepted the situation with the fortitude of a fatalist. With the utmost calm he inquired, "And now, Señor Capitán?" "And now," said Captain Blood, to give him the title he had assumed, "being a humane man, I am sorry to find that you're not dead from the tap we gave you. for it means that you'll be put to the trouble of dying all over again." "Ah!" Don Diego drew a deep breath. "But is that necessary?" he asked, without apparent perturbation. Captain Blood's blue eyes approved his bearing. "Ask yourself," said he. "Tell me, as an experienced and bloody pirate, what in my place would you do, yourself?" "Ah, but there's a difference." Don Diego sat up to argue the matter. "It lies in the fact that you boast yourself a humane man." Captain Blood perched himself on the edge of the long oak table. "But I am not a fool," said he, "and I'll not allow a natural Irish sentimentality to stand in the way of my doing what is necessary and proper. You and your 10 surviving scoundrels are a menace on this ship. More than that, she is none so well found in water and provisions. True, we are fortunately a small number, but you and your party inconveniently increase it. So that on every hand, you see, prudence suggests to us that we should deny ourselves the pleasure of your company, and steel in our soft hearts to the inevitable, invite you to be so obliging as to step over the side." "I see," said the Spaniard pensively. He swung his legs from the couch, and sat now upon the edge of it, his elbows on his knees. He had taken the measure of his man, and met him with a mock urbanity and suave detachment that matched his own. "I confess," he admitted, "that there is much force in what you say." "You take a load from my mind," said Captain Blood. "I would not appear unnecessarily harsh, especially since I and my friends owe you so very much. For, whatever it may have been to the others, to us your raid on Barbados was most opportune. I am glad, therefore, that you agree that I have no choice. But, my friend, I did not agree so much. Well, if there is any alternative that you can suggest, I shall be most happy to hear it." Don Diego stroked his pointed black beard. "Can you give me until morning for reflection? My head aches so damnably that I am incapable of thought, and this, you will admit, is a matter that asks serious thought." Captain Blood stood up. From a shelf he took a half-hour glass, reversed it so that the bulb containing the red sand was uppermost, and stood it on the table. "I am sorry to press you in such a manner, Don Diego, but 1 glass is all that I can give you. If by the time these sands have run out you can propose no acceptable alternative, I shall most reluctantly be driven to ask you to go over the side with your friends." Captain Blood bowed, went out, and locked the door. Elbows on his knees and face in his hands, Don Diego sat watching the rusty sands as they filtered from upper to the lower bulb. And what time he watched, the lines in his lean brown face grew deeper. Punctually as the last grains ran out, the door reopened. The Spaniard sighed and sat upright to face the returning Captain Blood with the answer for which he came. "I have thought of an alternative, Sir Capitan, but it depends upon your charity. It is that you put us ashore on one of the islands of this pestilent archipelago, and leave us to shift for ourselves." Captain Blood pursed his lips. "It has its difficulties," said he slowly. "I feared it would be so." Don Diego sighed again and stood up. "Let us say no more." The light blue eyes played over him like points of steel. "You are not afraid to die, Don Diego?" The Spaniard threw back his head, a frown between his eyes. "The question is offensive, sir." "Then let me put it in another way, perhaps more happily. You do not desire to live?" "Ah, that I can answer. I do desire to live, and even more do I desire that my son may live. But the desire shall not make a coward of me for your amusement, Master Mocker." It was the first sign he had shown of the least heat or resentment. Captain Blood did not answer directly. As before, he perched himself on the corner of the table. "Would you be willing, sir, to earn life and liberty for yourself, your son, and the other Spaniards who are on board?" "To earn it," said Don Diego, and the watchful blue eyes did not miss the quiver that ran through him. "To earn it, do you say? Why, if the service you would propose is one that cannot hurt my honour..." "Could I be guilty of that?" protested the captain. "I realize that even a pirate has his honour." And forthwith he propounded his offer. "If you will look from those windows, Don Diego, you will see what appears to be a cloud on the horizon. That is the island of Barbados well astern. All day we have been sailing east before the wind, with but one intent, to set as great a distance between Barbados and ourselves as possible. But now, almost out of sight of the land, we are in a difficulty. The only man among us schooled in the art of navigation is fevered, delirious, in fact, as a result of certain ill treatment he received ashore before we carried him away with us. I can handle a ship in action, and there are 1 or 2 men aboard who can assist me, but of the higher mysteries of seamanship, and of the art of finding a way over the trackless wastes of ocean, we know nothing. To hug the land, and to go blundering about what you so aptly called this pestilent archipelago, is for us to court disaster, as you can perhaps conceive. And so it comes to this. We desire to make for the Dutch settlement of Curaçao as straightly as possible. Will you pledge me your honour, if I release you upon parole, that you will navigate us thither? If so, we will release you and your surviving men upon arrival there." Don Diego bowed his head upon his breast, and strode away in thought to the stern windows. There he stood looking out upon the sunlit sea and the dead water in which the great ships wake, his ship, which these English dogs had wrested from him, his ship, which he was asked to bring safely into a port where she would be completely lost to him, and refitted perhaps to make war upon his kin. That was in one scale. In the other were the lives of 16 men. 14 of them mattered little to him, but the remaining 2 were his own and his son's. He turned at length, and his back being to the light, the captain could not see how pale his face had grown. "I accept," he said. End of chapter 10.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jeff Robinson. Captain Blood by Rafael Sabatini. Chapter 11. Filial Piety. By virtue of the pledge he had given, Don Diego de Espinosa enjoyed the freedom of the ship that had been his, and the navigation which he had undertaken was left entirely in his hands, and because those who manned her were new to the seas of the Spanish Main, and because even the things that had happened in Bridgetown were not enough to teach them to regard every Spaniard as a treacherous, cruel dog to be slain at sight, they used him with the civility which his own suave urbanity invited. He took his meals in the great cabin with Blood and the 3 officers elected to support him, Hagthorpe, Wolverston, and Dyke. They found Don Diego an agreeable, even an amusing companion, and their friendly feeling towards him was fostered by his fortitude and brave equanimity in this adversity. That Don Diego was not playing fair it was impossible to suspect. Moreover, there was no conceivable reason why he should not. And he had been of the utmost frankness with them. He had denounced their mistake in sailing before the wind upon leaving Barbados. They should have left the island to leeward, heading into the Caribbean and away from the archipelago. As it was, they would now be forced to pass through this archipelago again, so as to make Curacao, and this passage was not to be accomplished without some measure of risk to themselves. At any point between the islands, they might come upon an equal or superior craft. Whether she were Spanish or English would be equally bad for them, and being undermanned, they were in no case to fight. To lessen this risk as far as possible, Don Diego directed at first a southerly and then a westerly course, and so, taking a line midway between the islands of Tobago and Grenada, they won safely through the danger zone, and came into the comparative security of the Caribbean Sea. "If this wind holds," he told them that night at supper, after he had announced to them their position, "we should reach Curacao inside 3 days." For 3 days the wind held, Indeed, it freshened a little on the second, and yet when the third night descended upon them, they had still made no landfall. The Cinco Llagas was ploughing through a sea contained on every side by the blue bowl of heaven. Captain Blood uneasily mentioned it to Don Diego. "It will be for tomorrow morning," he was answered, with calm conviction. "By all the saints, it is always tomorrow morning with you Spaniards, and tomorrow never comes, my friend." "But this tomorrow is coming, rest assured. However early you may be astir, you shall see land ahead, Don Pedro." Captain Blood passed on, content, and went to visit Jerry Pitt, his patient, to whose condition Don Diego owed his chance of life. For 24 hours now the fever had left the sufferer, and under Peter Blood's dressings his lacerated back was beginning to heal satisfactorily. So far, indeed, was he recovered, that he complained of his confinement, of the heat in his cabin. To indulge him, Captain Blood consented that he should take the air on deck, and so, as the last of the daylight was fading from the sky, Jeremy Pitt came forth upon the captain's arm. Seated on the hatch coamings, the Somersetshire gratefully filled his lungs with the cool night air, and professed himself revived thereby. Then, with the seaman's instinct, his eyes wandered to the darkling vault of heaven, spangled already with a myriad golden points of light. Awhile he scanned it idly, vacantly. Then his attention became sharply fixed. He looked round and up at Captain Blood, who stood beside him. "Do you know anything of astronomy, Peter?" quoth he. "Astronomy, is it? Faith now, I couldn't tell the belt of Orion from the girdle of Venus." "Ah, and I suppose all the others of this lubberly crew share your ignorance. It would be more amiable of you to suppose that they exceed it." Jeremy pointed ahead to a spot of light in the heavens over the starboard bow. "That is the North Star," said he. "Is it now? Glory be. I wonder you can pick it out from the rest." "And the North Star ahead almost over your starboard bow means that we're steering a course north, northwest, or maybe north by west, for I doubt if we are standing more than 10 degrees westward." "And why shouldn't we?" wondered Captain Blood. "You told me, didn't you, that we came west of the archipelago between Tobago and Grenada, steering for Curacao. If that were our present course, we should have the North Star abeam, out yonder." On the instant, Mr. Blood shed his laziness. He stiffened with apprehension, and was about to speak, when a shaft of light clove from the gloom above their heads, coming from the door of the poop cabin, which had just been opened. It closed again, and presently there was a step on the companion. Don Diego was approaching. Captain Blood's fingers pressed Jerry's shoulder with significance. Then he called the Don, and spoke to him in English, as had become his custom when others were present. "Will you settle a slight dispute for us, Don Diego?" said he, lightly. "We are arguing, Mr. Pitt and I, as to which is the North Star." "So?" The Spaniard's tone was easy. There was almost a suggestion that laughter lurked behind it, and the reason for this was yielded by his next sentence. "But you tell me, Mr. Pitt, he is your navigant?" "For lack of a better," laughed the captain, good-humouredly contemptuous. "Now I am ready to wager him 100 pieces of 8 that that is the North Star." And he flung out an arm towards a point of light in the heavens, straight abeam. He afterwards told Pitt that had Don Diego confirmed him, he would have run him through upon that instant. Far from that, however, the Spaniard freely expressed his scorn. "You have the assurance that is of ignorance, Don Pedro, and you lose. The North Star is this one," and he indicated it. "You are sure?" "But my dear Don Pedro," the Spaniard's tone was one of amused protest, "but is it possible that I mistake? Besides, is there not the compass? Come to the binnacle, and see there what course we make." His utter frankness and the easy manner of one who has nothing to conceal resolved at once the doubt that had leapt so suddenly in the mind of Captain Blood. Pitt was satisfied less easily. "In that case, Don Diego, will you tell me, since Curacao is our destination, why our course is what it is?" Again there was no faintest hesitation on Don Diego's part. "You have reason to ask," said he, and sighed. "I had hoped it would not be observed. I have been careless. Oh, of a carelessness very culpable. I neglect observation. Always it is my way. I make too sure. I count too much on dead reckoning. And so today I find when at last I take out the quadrant that we do come by a half-degree too much south, so that Curacao is now almost due north. That is what caused the delay, but we will be there tomorrow." The explanation, so completely satisfactory, and so readily and candidly forthcoming, left no room for further doubt that Don Diego should have been false to his parole, and when presently Don Diego had withdrawn again, Captain Blood confessed to Pitt that it was absurd to have suspected him. Whatever his antecedents, he had proved his quality when he announced himself ready to die sooner than enter into any undertaking that could hurt his honor or his country. New to the seas of the Spanish Main, and to the ways of the adventurers who sailed it, Captain Blood still entertained illusions, but the next dawn was to shatter them rudely, and forever. Coming on deck before the sun was up, he saw land ahead, as the Spaniard had promised them last night. Some 10 miles ahead it lay, a long coastline filling the horizon east and west, with a massive headland jutting forward straight before them. Staring at it, he frowned. He had not conceived that Curacao was of such considerable dimensions. Indeed, this looked less like an island than the main itself. Beating out a weather against the gentle landward breeze, he beheld a great ship on their starboard bow that he conceived to be some 3 or 4 miles off, and, as well as he could judge her at that distance, of a tonnage equal if not superior to their own. Even as he watched her, she altered her course, and going about, came heading towards them, close-hauled. A dozen of his fellows were astir on the forecastle, looking eagerly ahead, and the sound of their voices and laughter reached him across the length of the stately Cinco Llagas. "There," said a soft voice behind him in liquid Spanish, "is the promised land, Don Pedro." It was something in that voice, a muffled note of exultation, that awoke suspicion in him, and made whole the half-doubt he had been entertaining. He turned sharply to face Don Diego, so sharply that the sly smile was not effaced from the Spaniard's countenance before Captain Blood's eyes had flashed upon it. "You find an odd satisfaction in the sight of it, all things considered," said Mr. Blood. "Of course." The Spaniard rubbed his hands, and Mr. Blood observed that they were unsteady. "The satisfaction of a mariner." "Or of a traitor? Which?" Blood asked him quietly, and as the Spaniard fell back before him with suddenly altered countenance that confirmed his every suspicion, he flung an arm out in the direction of the distant shore. "What land is that?" he demanded. "Will you have the effrontery to tell me that that is the coast of Curacao?" He advanced upon Don Diego suddenly, and Don Diego, step by step, fell back. "Shall I tell you what land it is? Shall I?" His fierce assumption of knowledge seemed to dazzle and dare the Spaniard. For still Don Diego made no answer, and then Captain Blood drew a bow at a venture. Or not quite at a venture. Such a coastline as that, if not of the Main itself, and the Main he knew it could not be, must belong to either Cuba or Hispaniola. Now knowing Cuba to lie farther north and west of the two, it followed, he reasoned swiftly, that if Don Diego meant betrayal, he would steer for the nearer of these Spanish territories. "That land, you treacherous forsworn Spanish dog, is the island of Hispaniola." Having said it, he closely watched the swarthy face, now overspread with pallor, to see the truth or falsehood of his guess reflected there. But now the retreating Spaniard had come to the middle of the quarter-deck, where the mizzen sail made a screen to shut them off from the eyes of the Englishmen below. His lips writhed in a snarling smile. "Ah, pero Inglés, you know too much," he said under his breath, and sprang for the captain's throat. Tight-locked in each other's arms, they swayed a moment, then together went down upon the deck, the Spaniard's feet jerked from under him by the right leg of Captain Blood. The Spaniard had depended upon his strength, which was considerable, but it proved no match for the steady muscles of the Irishman, tempered of late by the vicissitudes of slavery. He had depended upon choking the life out of Blood, and so gaining the half-hour that might be necessary to bring up that fine ship that was beating towards them. A Spanish ship, perforce, since none other would be so boldly cruising in these Spanish waters off Hispaniola. But all that Don Diego had accomplished was to betray himself completely, and to no purpose. This he realized when he found himself upon his back, pinned down by Blood, who was kneeling on his chest, whilst the men, summoned by their captain's shout, came clattering up the companion. "Will I say a prayer for your dirty soul now, whilst I am in this position?" Captain Blood was furiously mocking him. But the Spaniard, though defeated, now beyond hope for himself, forced his lips to smile, and gave back mockery for mockery. "Who will pray for your soul, I wonder, when that galleon comes to lie board and board with you." "That galleon!" echoed Captain Blood, with sudden and awful realization that already it was too late to avoid the consequences of Don Diego's betrayal of them. "That galleon," Don Diego repeated, and added with a deepening sneer, "Do you know what ship it is? I will tell you. It is the Encarnacion, the flagship of Don Miguel de Espinosa, the Lord Admiral of Castile, and Don Miguel is my brother. It is a very fortunate encounter. The Almighty, you see, watches over the destinies of Catholic Spain." There was no trace of humor or urbanity now in Captain Blood. His light eyes blazed. His face was set. He rose, relinquishing the Spaniard to his men. "Make him fast," he bade them. "Truss him, wrist and heel, but don't hurt him, not so much as a hair of his precious head." The injunction was very necessary. Frenzied by the thought that they were likely to exchange the slavery from which they had so lately escaped for a slavery still worse, they would have torn the Spaniard limb from limb upon the spot. And if they now obeyed their captain and refrained, it was only because the sudden, steely note in his voice promised for Don Diego Valdez something far more exquisite than death. "You scum! You dirty pirate! You man of honor!" Captain Blood apostrophized his prisoner. But Don Diego looked up at him and laughed. "You underrated me." He spoke English so that all might hear. "I tell you that I was not fear death, and I show you that I was not fear it. You no understand. You just an English dog." "Irish, if you please," Captain Blood corrected him. "And your parole, you tyke of Spain?" "You think I give my parole to leave you sons of filth with this beautiful Spanish ship, to go make war upon other Spaniards? Ha!" Don Diego laughed in his throat. "You fool. You can kill me. Pish! It is very well. I die with my work well done. In less than an hour you will be the prisoners of Spain, and the Cinco Llagas will go belong to Spain again." Captain Blood regarded him steadily out of a face which, if impassive, had paled under its deep tan. About the prisoner, clamant, infuriated, ferocious, the rebel's convict surged, almost literally athirst for his blood. "Wait," Captain Blood imperiously commanded, and turning on his heel, he went aside to the rail. As he stood there deep in thought, he was joined by Hagthorpe, Wolverstone, and Ogle the gunner. In silence they stared with him across the water at that other ship. She had veered a point away from the wind, and was running now on a line that must in the end converge with that of the Cinco Llagas. "In less than half an hour," said Blood presently, "we shall have her athwart our hawse, sweeping our decks with her guns." "We can fight," said the one-eyed giant with an oath. "Fight!" sneered Blood. "Undermanned as we are, mustering a bare 20 men, in what case are we to fight? No, there would be only one way, to persuade her that all is well aboard, that we are Spaniards, so that she may leave us to continue on our course." "And how is that possible?" Hagthorpe asked. "It isn't possible," said Blood. "If it—" And then he broke off, and stood musing, his eyes upon the green water. Ogle, with a bent for sarcasm, interposed a suggestion bitterly. "We might send Don Diego de Espinosa in a boat manned by his Spaniards to assure his brother the Admiral that we are all loyal subjects of his Catholic Majesty." The captain swung round, and for an instant looked as if he would have struck the gunner. Then his expression changed. The light of inspiration was in his glance. "Bedad, you've said it. He doesn't fear death, this damned pirate, but his son may take a different view. Filial piety's mighty strong in Spain." He swung on his heel abruptly, and strode back to the knot of men about his prisoner. "Here," he shouted to them. "Bring him below." And he led the way down to the waist, and thence by the booby hatch to the gloom of the 'tween decks, where the air was rank with the smell of tar and spun yarn. Going aft, he threw open the door of the spacious wardroom, and went in, followed by a dozen of the hands with the pinioned Spaniard. Every man aboard would have followed him, but for his sharp command to some of them to remain on deck with Hagthorpe. In the wardroom, the 3 stern chasers were in position, loaded, their muzzles thrusting through the open ports, precisely as the Spanish gunners had left them. "Here, Ogle, is work for you," said Blood, and as the burly gunner came thrusting forward through the little throng of gaping men, Blood pointed to the middle chaser. "Have that gun hauled back," he ordered. When this was done, Blood beckoned those who held Don Diego. "Lash him across the mouth of it," he bade them, and whilst, assisted by another two, they made haste to obey, he turned to the others. "To the roundhouse, some of you, and fetch the Spanish prisoners. And you, Dyke, go up and bid them set the flag of Spain aloft." Don Diego, with his body stretched in an arc across the cannon's mouth, legs and arms lashed to the carriage on either side of it, eyeballs rolling in his head, glared maniacally at Captain Blood. A man may not fear to die, and yet be appalled by the form in which death comes to him. From frothing lips he hurled blasphemies and insults at his tormentor. "Foul barbarian, inhuman savage, accursed heretic, will it not content you to kill me in some Christian fashion?" Captain Blood vouchsafed him a malignant smile before he turned to meet the 15 manacled Spanish prisoners who were thrust into his presence. Approaching, they had heard Don Diego's outcries. At close quarters now they beheld with horror-stricken eyes his plight. From amongst them a comely, olive-skinned stripling, distinguished in bearing and apparel from his companions, started forward with an anguished cry of "Father!" Writhing in the arms that made haste to seize and hold him, he called upon heaven and hell to avert this horror, and lastly addressed to Captain Blood an appeal for mercy that was at once fierce and piteous. Considering him, Captain Blood thought with satisfaction that he displayed the proper degree of filial piety. He afterwards confessed that for a moment he was in danger of weakening, that for a moment his mind rebelled against the pitiless thing it had planned, but to correct the sentiment, he evoked a memory of what these Spaniards had performed in Bridgetown. Again he saw the white face of that child, Mary Trail, as she fled in horror before the jeering ruffian whom he had slain, and other things even more unspeakable seen on that dreadful evening rose now before the eyes of his memory to stiffen his faltering purpose. The Spaniards had shown themselves without mercy or sentiment or decency of any kind. Stuffed with religion, they were without a spark of that Christianity, the symbol of which was mounted on the mainmast of the approaching ship. A moment ago, this cruel, vicious Don Diego had insulted the Almighty by his assumption that he kept a specially benevolent watch over the destinies of Catholic Spain. Don Diego should be taught his error. Recovering the cynicism in which he had approached his task, the cynicism essential to its proper performance, he commanded Ogle to kindle a match and remove the leaden apron from the touch-hole of the gun that bore Don Diego. Then, as the younger Espinosa broke into fresh intercessions mingled with imprecations, he wheeled upon him sharply. "Peace," he snapped. "Peace, and listen. It is no part of my intention to blow your father to hell as he deserves, or indeed to take his life at all." Having surprised the lad into silence by that promise, a promise surprising enough in all the circumstances, he proceeded to explain his aims in that faultless and elegant Castilian of which he was fortunately master, as fortunately for Don Diego as for himself. "It is your father's treachery that has brought us into this plight, and deliberately into risk of capture and death aboard that ship of Spain. Just as your father recognized his brother's flagship, so will his brother have recognized the Cinco Llagas. So far, then, all is well. But presently the Encarnacion will be sufficiently close to perceive that here all is not as it should be. Sooner or later she must guess or discover what is wrong, and then she will open fire or lay us board and board. Now, we are in no case to fight, as your father knew when he ran us into this trap. But fight we will, if we are driven to it. We make no tame surrender to the ferocity of Spain." He laid his hand on the breech of the gun that bore Don Diego. "Understand this clearly. To the first shot from the Encarnacion, this gun will fire the answer. I make myself clear, I hope?" White-faced and trembling, young Espinosa stared into the pitiless blue eyes that so steadily regarded him. "If it is clear," he faltered, breaking the utter silence in which all were standing. "But, name of God, how should it be clear? How should I understand? Can you avert the fight? If you know a way, and if I, or these, can help you to it, if that is what you mean, in heaven's name let me hear it." "A fight would be averted if Don Diego de Espinosa were to go aboard his brother's ship, and by his presence and assurances inform the admiral that all is well with the Cinco Llagas, that she is indeed still a ship of Spain, as her flag now announces. But of course Don Diego cannot go in person, because he is otherwise engaged. He has a slight touch of fever, shall we say, that detains him in his cabin. But you, his son, may convey all this and some other matters, together with his homage to your uncle. You shall go in a boat manned by 6 of these Spanish prisoners, and I, a distinguished Spaniard delivered from captivity in Barbados by your recent raid, will accompany you to keep you in countenance. If I return alive, and without accident of any kind to hinder our free sailing hence, Don Diego shall have his life, as shall every one of you. But if there is the least misadventure, be it from treachery or ill fortune, I care not which, the battle, as I have had the honour to explain, will be opened on our side by this gun, and your father will be the first victim of the conflict." He paused a moment. There was a hum of approval from his comrades, an anxious stirring among the Spanish prisoners. Young Espinosa stood before him, the colour ebbing and flowing in his cheeks. He waited for some direction from his father, but none came. Don Diego's courage, it seemed, had sadly waned under that rude test. He hung limply in his fearful bonds, and was silent. Evidently he dared not encourage his son to defiance, and presumably was ashamed to urge him to yield. Thus he left decision entirely with the youth. "Come," said Blood. "I have been clear enough, I think. What do you say?" Don Esteban moistened his parched lips, and with the back of his hand mopped the anguished sweat from his brow. His eyes gazed wildly a moment upon the shoulders of his father, as if beseeching guidance. But his father remained silent. Something like a sob escaped the boy. I accept," he answered at last, and swung to the Spaniards. "And you will accept too," he insisted passionately. "For Don Diego's sake, and for your own, for all our sakes. If you do not, this man will butcher us all without mercy." Since he yielded, and their leader himself counselled no resistance, why should they encompass their own destruction by a gesture of feudal heroism? They answered without much hesitation that they would do as was required of them. Blood turned and advanced to Don Diego. "I am sorry to inconvenience you in this fashion, but—" For a second he checked and frowned as his eyes intently observed the prisoner. Then, after that scarcely perceptible pause, he continued, "But I do not think that you have anything beyond this inconvenience to apprehend, and you may depend upon me to shorten it as far as possible." Don Diego made him no answer. Peter Blood waited a moment, observing him. Then he bowed and stepped back. End of chapter 11. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jeff Robinson. Captain Blood by Rafael Sabatini. Chapter 12. Don Pedro Sangre. The Cinco Llagas and the Encarnacion, after a proper exchange of signals, lay hove to within a quarter of a mile of each other, and across the intervening space of gently heaving, sunlit waters sped a boat from the former, manned by 6 Spanish seamen, and bearing in her stern sheets Don Esteban de Espinosa and Captain Peter Blood. She also bore 2 treasure chests containing 50,000 pieces of 8. Gold has at all times been considered the best of testimonies of good faith, and Blood was determined that in all respects appearances should be entirely on his side. His followers had accounted this a supererogation of pretense, but Blood's will in the matter had prevailed. He carried further a bulky package addressed to a grande of Spain, heavily sealed with the arms of Espinosa, another piece of evidence hastily manufactured in the cabin of the Cinco Llagas, and he was spending these last moments in completing his instructions to his young companion. Don Esteban expressed his last lingering uneasiness. "But if you should betray yourself?" he cried. "It will be unfortunate for everybody. I advised your father to say a prayer for our success. I depend upon you to help me more materially." "I will do my best. God knows I will do my best," the boy protested. Blood nodded thoughtfully, and no more was said until they bumped alongside the towering mass of the Encarnacion. Up the ladder went Don Esteban, closely followed by Captain Blood. In the waist stood the Admiral himself to receive them, a handsome, self-sufficient man, very tall and stiff, a little older and grayer than Don Diego, whom he closely resembled. He was supported by 4 officers and a friar in the black and white habit of Saint Dominic. Don Miguel opened his arms to his nephew, whose lingering panic he mistook for pleasurable excitement, and having enfolded him to his bosom, turned to greet Don Esteban's companion. Peter Blood bowed gracefully, entirely at his ease, so far as might be judged from appearances. "I am," he announced, making a literal translation of his name, "Don Pedro Sangre, an unfortunate gentleman of Leon, lately delivered from captivity by Don Esteban's most gallant father." And in a few words he sketched the imagined conditions of his capture by, and deliverance from, those accursed heretics who held the island of Barbados. "Benedicamus Domino," said the friar to his tale. "Ex hoc nunc et usque in seculum," replied Blood, the occasional papist, with lowered eyes. The admiral and his attending officers gave him a sympathetic hearing and a cordial welcome. Then came the dreaded question. "But where is my brother? Why has he not come himself to greet me?" It was young Espinosa who answered this. "My father is afflicted at denying himself that honor and pleasure. But unfortunately, sir uncle, he is a little indisposed. Oh, nothing grave, merely sufficient to make him keep his cabin. It is a little fever, the result of a slight wound taken in the recent raid upon Barbados, which resulted in this gentleman's happy deliverance." "Nay, nephew, nay," Don Miguel protested with ironic repudiation. "I can have no knowledge of these things. I have the honor to represent upon the seas His Catholic Majesty, who is at peace with the King of England. Already you have told me more than it is good for me to know. I will endeavour to forget it, and I will ask you, sirs," he added, glancing at his officers, "to forget it also." But he winked into the twinkling eyes of Captain Blood, then added matter that at once extinguished that twinkle. "But since Diego cannot come to me, why, I will go across to him." For a moment Don Esteban's face was a mask of pallid fear. Then Blood was speaking in a lowered, confidential voice that admirably blended suavity, impressiveness, and sly mockery. "If you please, Don Miguel, but that is the very thing you must not do, the very thing Don Diego does not wish you to do. You must not see him until his wounds are healed. That is his own wish. That is the real reason why he is not here. For the truth is that his wounds are not so grave as to have prevented his coming. It was his consideration of himself, and the false position in which you would be placed if you had direct word from him of what has happened. As your Excellency has said, there is peace between His Catholic Majesty and the King of England, and your brother Don Diego." He paused a moment. "I am sure that I need say no more. What you hear from us is no more than a mere rumor. Your Excellency understands." His Excellency frowned thoughtfully. "I understand, in part," said he. Captain Blood had a moment's uneasiness. Did the Spaniard doubt his bona fides? Yet in dress and speech he knew himself to be impeccably Spanish, and was not Don Esteban there to confirm him? He swept on to afford further confirmation before the Admiral could say another word. "And we have in the boat below 2 chests containing 50,000 pieces of eight, which we are to deliver to your Excellency." His Excellency jumped. There was a sudden stir among his officers. "They are the ransom extracted by Don Diego from the governor of—" "Not another word in the name of heaven!" cried the Admiral in alarm. "My brother wishes me to assume charge of this money, to carry it to Spain for him? Well, that is a family matter between my brother and myself, so it can be done. But I must not know—" He broke off. "Hum! A glass of Malaga in my cabin, if you please," he invited them, "whilst the chests are being hauled aboard." He gave his orders touching the embarkation of these chests, then led the way to his regally appointed cabin, his 4 officers and the friar following by particular invitation. Seated at table there, with the tawny wine before them, and the servant who had poured it withdrawn, Don Miguel laughed, and stroked his pointed, grizzled beard. "Virgen Santissima! That brother of mine has a mind that thinks of everything. Left to myself, I might have committed a fine indiscretion by venturing aboard his ship at such a moment. I might have seen things which, as Admiral of Spain, it would be difficult for me to ignore." Both Esteban and Blood made haste to agree with him, and then Blood raised his glass and drank to the glory of Spain, and the damnation of the besotted James who occupied the throne of England. The latter part of his toast was at least sincere. The Admiral laughed. "Sir, you need my brother here to curb your imprudences. You should remember that His Catholic Majesty and the King of England are very good friends. That is not a toast to propose in this cabin. But since it has been proposed, and by one who has such particular personal cause to hate these English hounds, why, we will honour it. But unofficially." They laughed, and drank the damnation of King James, quite unofficially, but the more fervently on that account. Then Don Esteban, uneasy on the score of his father, and remembering that the agony of Don Diego was being protracted with every moment that they left him in his dreadful position, rose and announced that they must be returning. "My father," he explained, "is in haste to reach San Domingo. He desired me to stay no longer than necessary to embrace you. If you will give us leave, then, Sir Uncle." In the circumstances, Sir Uncle did not insist. As they returned to the ship's side, Blood's eyes anxiously scanned the line of seamen leaning over the bulwarks in idle talk with the Spaniards in the cockboat that waited at the ladder's foot, but their manner showed him that there was no ground for his anxiety. The boat's crew had been wisely reticent. The Admiral took leave of them, of Esteban affectionately, of Blood ceremoniously. "I regret to lose you so soon, Don Pedro. I wish that you could have made a longer visit to the Encarnacion." "I am indeed unfortunate," said Captain Blood politely. "But I hope that we may meet again." "That is to flatter me beyond all that I deserve." They reached the boat, and she cast off from the great ship. As they were pulling away, the Admiral waving to them from the taffrail, they heard the shrill whistle of the boatswain piping the hands to their stations, and before they had reached the Cinco Llagas, they beheld the Encarnacion go about under sail. She dipped her flag to them, and from her poop a gun fired a salute. Aboard the Cinco Llagas someone, it proved afterwards to be Hagthorpe, had the wit to reply in the same fashion. The comedy was ended. Yet there was something else to follow as an epilogue, a thing that added a grim, ironic flavour to the whole. As they stepped into the waist of the Cinco Llagas, Hagthorpe advanced to receive them. Blood observed the set, almost scared expression on his face. "I see that you've found it," he said quietly. Hagthorpe's eyes looked a question, but his mind dismissed whatever thought it held. "Don Diego," he was beginning, and then stopped, and looked curiously at Blood. Noting the pause and the look, Esteban bounded forward, his face livid. "Have you broken faith, you curs? Has he come to harm?" he cried, and the 6 Spaniards behind him grew clamorous with furious questionings. "We do not break faith," said Hagthorpe firmly, so firmly that he quieted them. "And in this case there was not the need. Don Diego died in his bonds before ever you reached the Encarnacion." Peter Blood said nothing. "Died!" screamed Esteban. "You killed him, you mean. Of what did he die?" Hagthorpe looked at the boy. "If I am a judge," he said, "Don Diego died of fear." Don Esteban struck Hagthorpe across the face at that, and Hagthorpe would have struck back, but that Blood got between, whilst his followers seized the lad. "Let be," said Blood. "You provoked the boy by your insult to his father." "I was not concerned to insult," said Hagthorpe, nursing his cheek. "It is what has happened. Come and look." "I have seen," said Blood. "He died before I left the Cinco Llagas. He was hanging dead in his bonds when I spoke to him before leaving." "What are you saying?" cried Esteban. Blood looked at him gravely, yet for all his gravity he seemed almost to smile, though without mirth. "If you had known that, eh?" he asked at last. For a moment Don Esteban stared at him, wide-eyed, incredulous. "I don't believe you," he said at last. "Yet you may. I am a doctor, and I know death when I see it." Again there came a pause, whilst conviction sank into the lad's mind. "If I had known that," he said at last in a thick voice, "you would be hanging from the yardarm of the Encarnacion at this moment." "I know," said Blood. "I am considering it, the profit that a man may find in the ignorance of others." "But you'll hang there yet," the boy raved. Captain Blood shrugged, and turned on his heel. But he did not on that account disregard the words, nor did Hagthorpe, nor yet the others who overheard them, as they showed at a council held that night in the cabin. This council was met to determine what should be done with their Spanish prisoners, considering that Curacao now lay beyond their reach, as they were running short of water and provisions, and also that Pitt was hardly yet in case to undertake the navigation of the vessel. It had been decided that, going east of Hispaniola, and then sailing along its northern coast, they should make for Tortuga, that haven of the buccaneers, in which lawless port they had at least no danger of recapture to apprehend. It was now a question whether they should convey the Spaniards thither with them, or turn them off in a boat to make the best of their way to the coast of Hispaniola, which was but 10 miles off. This was the course urged by Blood himself. "There's nothing else to be done," he insisted. "In Tortuga they would be flayed alive." "Which is less than the swine deserve," growled Wolverstone. "And you'll remember, Peter," put in Hagthorpe, "that boy's threat to you this morning. If he escapes, and carries word of all this to his uncle, the Admiral, the execution of that threat will become more than possible." It says much for Peter Blood that the argument should have left him unmoved. It is a little thing, perhaps, but in a narrative in which there is so much that tells against him, I cannot, since my story is in the nature of a brief for the defense, afford to slur a circumstance that is so strongly in his favor, a circumstance revealing that the cynicism attributed to him proceeded from his reason, and from a brooding over wrongs, rather than from any natural instincts. I care nothing for his threats. "You should," said Wolverstone. "The wise thing 'ud be to hang him, along o' all the rest." "It is not human to be wise," said Blood. "It is much more human to err, though perhaps exceptional to err on the side of mercy. We'll be exceptional. Oh, faugh! I've no stomach for cold-blooded killing. At daybreak, pack the Spaniards into a boat with a keg of water and a sack of dumplings, and let them go to the devil." That was the last word on the subject, and it prevailed by virtue of the authority they had vested in him, and of which he had taken so firm a grip. At daybreak, Don Esteban and his followers were put off in a boat. 2 days later, the Cinco Llagas sailed into the rock-bound bay of Cayona, which nature seemed to have designed for the stronghold of those who had appropriated it. End of chapter 12.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Captain Blood by Rafael Sabatini. Chapter 13. Tortuga. It is time fully to disclose the fact that the survival of the story of Captain Blood's exploits is due entirely to the industry of Jeremy Pitt, the Somersetshire shipmaster. In addition to his ability as a navigator, this amiable young man appears to have wielded an indefatigable pen, and to have been inspired to indulge its fluency by the affection he very obviously bore to Peter Blood. He kept the log of the 40-gun frigate Arabella, on which he served as master, or, as we should say today, navigating officer, as no log I have ever seen was ever kept. It runs into some 20-odd volumes of assorted sizes, some of which are missing altogether, and others of which are so sadly depleted of leaves as to be of little use. But if at times in the laborious perusal of them they are preserved in the library of Mr. James Speke of Comerton, I have inveighed against these lacunae; at others I have been equally troubled by the excessive prolixity of what remains, and the difficulty of disintegrating from the confused whole the really essential parts. I have a suspicion that Esquemeling, though how or where I can make no surmise, must have obtained access to these records, and that he plucked from them the brilliant feathers of several exploits, to stick them into the tale of his own hero, Captain Morgan. But that is by the way. I mention it chiefly as a warning, for when presently I come to relate the affair of Maracaibo, those of you who have read Esquemeling may be in danger of supposing that Henry Morgan really performed those things which here are veraciously attributed to Peter Blood. I think, however, that when you come to weigh the motives actuating both Blood and the Spanish admiral in that affair, and when you consider how integrally the event is a part of Blood's history, whilst merely a detached incident in Morgan's, you will reach my own conclusion as to which is the real plagiarist. The first of these logs of Pitt's is taken up almost entirely with a retrospective narrative of the events up to the time of Blood's first coming to Tortuga. This and the Tannatt collection of state trials are the chief, though not the only, sources of my history so far. Pitt lays great stress upon the fact that it was the circumstances upon which I have dwelt, and these alone, that drove Peter Blood to seek an anchorage at Tortuga. He insists at considerable length, and with a vehemence which in itself makes it plain that an opposite opinion was held in some quarters, that it was no part of the design of Blood, or of any of his companions in misfortune, to join hands with the buccaneers, who, under a semi-official French protection, made of Tortuga a lair, whence they could sally out to drive their merciless piratical trade, chiefly at the expense of Spain. It was, Pitt tells us, Blood's original intention to make his way to France or Holland, but in the long weeks of waiting for a ship to convey him to one or the other of these countries, his resources dwindled and finally vanished. Also, his chronicler thinks that he detected signs of some secret trouble in his friend, and he attributes to this the abuses of the potent West Indian spirit of which Blood became guilty in those days of inaction, thereby sinking to the level of the wild adventurers with whom ashore he associated. I do not think that Pitt is guilty in this merely of special pleading, that he is putting forward excuses for his hero. I think that in those days there was a good deal to oppress Peter Blood. There was the thought of Arabella Bishop, and that this thought loomed large in his mind we are not permitted to doubt. He was maddened by the tormenting lure of the unattainable. He desired Arabella, yet knew her beyond his reach irrevocably, and for all time. Also, whilst he may have desired to go to France or Holland, he had no clear purpose to accomplish when he reached one or the other of these countries. He was, when all is said, an escaped slave, an outlaw in his own land, and a homeless outcast in any other. There remained the sea, which is free to all, and particularly alluring to those who feel themselves at war with humanity. And so, considering the adventurous spirit that once already had sent him a roving for the sheer love of it, considering that this spirit was heightened now by a recklessness begotten of his outlawry, that his training and skill in militant seamanship clamorously supported the temptations that were put before him, can you wonder, or dare you blame him, that in the end he succumbed? And remember that these temptations proceeded not only from adventurous buccaneering acquaintances in the taverns of that evil haven of Tortuga, but even from Monsieur d'Ogeron, the governor of the island, who levied as his harbor dues a percentage of 1/10 of all spoils brought into the bay, and who profited further by commissions upon money which he was desired to convert into bills of exchange upon France. A trade that might have worn a repellent aspect when urged by greasy, half-drunken adventurers, boucan hunters, lumbermen, beach-combers, English, French, and Dutch, became a dignified, almost official form of privateering when advocated by the courtly, middle-aged gentleman who, in representing the French West India Company, seemed to represent France herself. Moreover, to a man, not excluding Jeremy Pitt himself, in whose blood the call of the sea was insistent and imperative, those who had escaped with Peter Blood from the Barbados plantations, and who consequently, like himself, knew not whither to turn, were all resolved upon joining the great brotherhood of the coast, as those rovers called themselves. And they united theirs to the other voices that were persuading Blood, demanding that he should continue now in the leadership which he had enjoyed since they had left Barbados, and swearing to follow him loyally whithersoever he should lead them. And so, to condense all that Jeremy has recorded in the matter, Blood ended by yielding to external and internal pressure, abandoned himself to the stream of destiny. Fata viam invenerant is his own expression of it. If he resisted so long, it was, I think, the thought of Arabella Bishop that restrained him. That they should be destined never to meet again did not weigh at first, or indeed ever. He conceived the scorn with which she would come to hear of his having turned pirate, and the scorn, though as yet no more than imagined, hurt him as if it were already a reality. And even when he conquered this, still the thought of her was ever present. He compromised with the conscience that her memory kept so disconcertingly active. He vowed that the thought of her should continue ever before him to help him keep his hands as clean as a man might in this desperate trade upon which he was embarking. And so, Although he might entertain no delusive hope of ever winning her for his own, of ever even seeing her again, yet the memory of her was to abide in his soul as a bittersweet, purifying influence. The love that is never to be realized will often remain a man's guiding ideal. The resolve being taken, he went actively to work. Ogeron, most accommodating of governors, advanced him money for the proper equipment of his ship, the Cinco Llagas, which he renamed the Arabella. This after some little hesitation, fearful of thus setting his heart upon his leave. But his Barbados friends accounted it merely an expression of the ever-ready irony in which their leader dwelt. To the score of followers he already possessed, he added 60 more, picking his men with caution and discrimination, and he was an exceptional judge of men, from amongst the adventurers of Tortuga. With them all he entered into the articles usual among the brethren of the coast, under which each man was to be paid by a share in the prizes captured. In other respects, however, the articles were different. Aboard the Arabella there was to be none of the ruffian indiscipline that normally prevailed in buccaneering vessels. Those who shipped with him undertook obedience and submission in all things to himself, and to the officers appointed by election. Any to whom this clause in the articles was distasteful might follow some other leader. Towards the end of December, when the hurricane season had blown itself out, he put to sea in his well-found, well-manned ship, and before he returned in the following May from a protracted and adventurous cruise, the fame of Captain Peter Blood had run like ripples before the breeze across the face of the Caribbean Sea. There was a fight in the Windward Passage at the outset with a Spanish galleon, which had resulted in the gutting and finally the sinking of the Spaniard. There was a daring raid effected by means of several appropriated piraguas upon a Spanish pearl fleet in the Rio de la Hacha, from which they had taken a particularly rich haul of pearls. There was an overland expedition to the gold fields of the Santa Maria on the Main, the full tale of which is hardly credible, and there were lesser adventures, through all of which the crew of the Arabella came with credit and profit, if not entirely unscathed. And so it happened that before the Arabella came homing to Tortuga in the following May to refit and repair, for she was not without scars, as you conceive, the fame of her and of Peter Blood, her captain, had swept from the Bahamas to the Windward Isles, from New Providence to Trinidad. An echo of it had reached Europe, and at the court of St. James angry representations were made by the ambassador of Spain, to whom it was answered that it must not be supposed that this Captain Blood held any commission from the King of England, that he was, in fact, a proscribed rebel, an escaped slave, and any measures against him by his Catholic Majesty would receive the cordial approbation of King James II. Don Miguel de Espinosa, the admiral of Spain in the West Indies, and his nephew Don Esteban, who sailed with him, did not lack the will to bring the adventurer to the yardarm. With them this business of capturing Blood, which was now an international affair, was also a family matter. Spain, through the mouth of Don Miguel, did not spare her threats. The report of them reached Tortuga, and with it the assurance that Don Miguel had behind him not only the authority of his own nation, but that of the English king as well. It was a brutum fulmen that inspired no terrors in Captain Blood, nor was he likely, on account of it, to allow himself to run to rust in the security of Tortuga. For what he had suffered at the hands of man, he had chosen to make Spain the scapegoat. Thus he accounted that he served a twofold purpose. He took compensation, and at the same time served, not indeed the Stuart king, whom he despised, but England, and, for that matter, all the rest of civilized mankind, which cruel, treacherous, greedy, bigoted Castile sought to exclude from intercourse with the New World. One day, as he sat with Hagthorpe and Wolverstone over a pipe and a bottle of rum in the stifling reek of tar and stale tobacco of a waterside tavern, he was accosted by a splendid ruffian in a gold-lace coat of dark blue satin, with a crimson sash a foot wide about the waist. "C'est vous qu'on appelle le sang?" the fellow hailed him. Captain Blood looked up to consider the questioner before replying. The man was tall and built on lines of agile strength, with a swarthy, aquiline face that was brutally handsome. A diamond of great price flamed on the indifferently clean hand resting on the pommel of his long rapier, and there were gold rings in his ears, half concealed by long ringlets of oily chestnut hair. Captain Blood took the pipe stem from between his lips. "My name," he said, "is Peter Blood. The Spaniards know me for Don Pedro Sangre, and a Frenchman may call me Le Sang, if he pleases." "Good," said the gaudy adventurer in English, and without further invitation he drew up a stool and sat down at the greasy table. "My name," he informed the three men, two of whom at least were eyeing him askance, "it is Levasseur. You may have heard of me." They had, indeed. He commanded a privateer of 20 guns that had dropped anchor in the bay a week ago, manned by a crew mainly composed of French boucan hunters from northern Hispaniola, men who had good cause to hate the Spaniard with an intensity exceeding that of the English. Levasseur had brought them back to Tortuga from an indifferently successful cruise. It would need more, however, than lack of success to abate the fellow's monstrous vanity. A roaring, quarrelsome, hard-drinking, hard-gaming scoundrel, his reputation as a buccaneer stood high among the wild brethren of the coast. He enjoyed also a reputation of another sort. There was about his gaudy, swaggering raffishness something that the women found singularly alluring. That he should boast openly of his bonne fortune did not seem strange to Captain Blood. What he might have found strange was that there appeared to be some measure of justification for these boasts. It was current gossip that even Mademoiselle d'Ogeron, the governor's daughter, had been caught in the snare of his wild attractiveness, and that Levasseur had gone the length of audacity of asking her hand in marriage of her father. M. d'Ogeron had made him the only possible answer. He had shown him the door. Levasseur had departed in a rage, swearing that he would make Mademoiselle his wife in the teeth of all the fathers in Christendom, and that M. d'Ogeron should bitterly rue the affront he had put upon him. This was the man who now thrust himself upon Captain Blood with a proposal of association, offering him not only his sword, but his ship and the men who sailed in her. A dozen years ago, as a lad of barely 20, Levasseur had sailed with that monster of cruelty, l'Olonnais, and his own subsequent exploits bore witness and did credit to the school in which he had been reared. I doubt if in his day there was a greater scoundrel among the brethren of the coast than this Levasseur, and yet, repulsive though he found him, Captain Blood could not deny that the fellow's proposals displayed boldness, imagination, and resource, and he was forced to admit that jointly they could undertake operations of a greater magnitude than was possible singly to either of them. The climax of Levasseur's project was to be a raid upon the wealthy mainland city of Maracaibo, but for this, he admitted, 600 men at the very least would be required, and 600 men were not to be conveyed in the 2 bottoms they now commanded. Preliminary cruises must take place, having for one of their objects the capture of further ships. Because he disliked the man, Captain Blood could not commit himself at once, but because he liked the proposal, he consented to consider it. Being afterwards pressed by both Hagthorpe and Wolverstone, who did not share his own personal dislike of the Frenchman, the end of the matter was that, within a week, articles were drawn up between Levasseur and Blood, and signed by them and, as was usual, by the chosen representatives of their followers. These articles contained, inter alia, the common provisions that, should the 2 vessels separate, a strict account must afterwards be rendered of all prizes severally taken, whilst the vessel taking a prize should retain 3/5 of its value, surrendering 2/5 to its associate. These shares were subsequently to be subdivided among the crew of each vessel, in accordance with the articles already obtaining between each captain and his own men. For the rest, the articles contained all the clauses that were usual, among which was the clause that any man found guilty of abstracting or concealing any part of a prize, be it of the value of no more than a peso, should be summarily hanged from the yardarm. All being now settled, they made for sea, and on the very eve of sailing, Levasseur narrowly escaped being shot in a romantic attempt to scale the wall of the governor's garden, with the object of taking passionate leave of the infatuated Mademoiselle d'Ogeron. He desisted after having been twice fired upon from a fragrant ambush of palmetto trees where the governor's guards were posted, and he departed vowing to take different and very definite measures on his return. That night he slept on board his ship, which with characteristic flamboyance he had named La Foudre, and there on the following day he received a visit from Captain Blood, whom he greeted half mockingly as his admiral. The Irishman came to settle certain final details, of which all that need concern us is an understanding that, in the event of the two vessels becoming separated by accident or design, they should rejoin each other as soon as might be at Tortuga. Thereafter Levasseur entertained his admiral to dinner, and jointly they drank success to the expedition, so copiously on the part of Levasseur that when the time came to separate he was as nearly drunk as it seemed possible for him to be and yet retain his understanding. Finally, towards evening, Captain Blood went over the side, and was rowed back to his great ship with her red bulwarks and gilded ports, touched into a lovely thing of flame by the setting sun. He was a little heavy-hearted. I have said that he was a judge of men, and his judgment of Levasseur filled him with misgivings which were growing heavier in a measure as the hour of departure approached. He expressed it to Wolverstone, who met him as he stepped aboard the Arabella. "You over-persuaded me into those articles, you blackguard, and it'll surprise me if any good comes of this association." The giant rolled his single bloodthirsty eye and sneered, thrusting out his heavy jaw. "We'll wring the dog's neck if there's any treachery." "So we will, if we are there to wring it by then." And on that, dismissing the matter, "We sail in the morning, on the first of the ebb," he announced, and went off to his cabin. End of chapter 13. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Captain Blood by Rafael Sabatini. Section 14. Levasseur's Heroics. It would be somewhere about 10 o'clock on the following morning, a full hour before the time appointed for sailing, when a canoe brought up alongside La Foudre, and a half-caste Indian stepped out of her and went up the ladder. He was clad in drawers of hairy, untanned hide, and a red blanket served him for a cloak. He was the bearer of a folded scrap of paper for Captain Levasseur. The captain unfolded the letter, sadly soiled and crumpled by contact with the half-caste person. Its contents may be roughly translated thus: "My well-beloved, I am in the Dutch brig Jongvrow, which is about to sail. Resolved to separate us forever, my cruel father is sending me to Europe in my brother's charge. I implore you, come to my rescue. Deliver me, my well-beloved hero. Your desolated Madeleine, who loves you." The well-beloved hero was moved to the soul of him by that passionate appeal. His scowling glance swept the bay for the Dutch brig, which he knew had been due to sail for Amsterdam with a cargo of hides and tobacco. She was nowhere to be seen among the shipping in that narrow rock-bound harbor. He roared out the question in his mind. In answer, the half-caste pointed out beyond the frothing surf that marked the position of the reef constituting one of the stronghold's main defenses. Away beyond it, a mile or so distant, a sail was standing out to sea. "There she go," he said. "There!" The Frenchman gazed and stared, his face growing white. The man's wicked temper awoke, and turned to vent itself upon the messenger. "And where have you been that you come here only now with this? Answer me!" The half-caste shrank, terrified before his fury. His explanation, if he had one, was paralyzed by fear. Levasseur took him by the throat, shook him twice, snarling the while, then hurled him into the scuppers. The man's head struck the gunwale as he fell, and he lay there, quite still, a trickle of blood issuing from his mouth. Levasseur dashed one hand against the other as if dusting them. "Heave that muck overboard," he ordered some of those who stood idling in the waist. "Then up anchor, and let us after the Dutchman." "Steady, Captain, what's that?" There was a restraining hand upon his shoulder, and the broad face of his lieutenant, Cahusac, a burly, callous Breton scoundrel, was stolidly confronting him. Levasseur made clear his purpose with a deal of unnecessary obscenity. Cahusac shook his head. A Dutch brig, said he? Impossible! We should never be allowed. And who the devil will deny us? Levasseur was between amazement and fury. For one thing, there's your own crew, will be none too willing. For another, there's Captain Blood. I care nothing for Captain Blood. But it is necessary that you should. He has the power, the weight of metal and of men, and if I know him at all, he'll sink us before he'll suffer interference with the Dutch. He has his own views of privateering, this Captain Blood, as I warned you. Ah, said Levasseur, showing his teeth. But his eyes, riveted upon that distant sail, were gloomily thoughtful. Not for long. The imagination and resource which Captain Blood had detected in the fellow soon suggested a course. Cursing in his soul, and even before the anchor was weighed, the association in which he had entered, he was already studying ways of evasion. What Cahusac implied was true. Blood would never suffer violence to be done in his presence to a Dutchman, but it might be done in his absence, and being done, Blood must perforce condone it, since it would then be too late to protest. Within the hour, the Arabella and La Foudre were beating out to sea together. Without understanding the change of plan involved, Captain Blood nevertheless accepted it, and weighed anchor before the appointed time upon perceiving his associate to do so. All day the Dutch brig was in sight, though by evening she had dwindled to the merest speck on the northern horizon. The course prescribed for Blood and Levasseur lay eastward along the northern shores of Hispaniola. To that course the Arabella continued to hold steadily throughout the night. When day broke again, she was alone. La Foudre, under cover of the darkness, had struck away to the northeast, with every rag of canvas on her yards. Cahusac had attempted yet again to protest against this. The devil take you, Levasseur had answered him. A ship's a ship, be she Dutch or Spanish, and ships are our present need. That will suffice for the men. His lieutenant said no more, but from his glimpse of the letter, knowing that a girl and not a ship was his captain's real objective, he gloomily shook his head as he rolled away on his bowed legs to give the necessary orders. Dawn found La Foudre close on the Dutchman's heels, not a mile astern, and the sight of her very evidently flustered the young vrouw. No doubt Mademoiselle's brother, recognizing Levasseur's ship, would be responsible for the Dutch uneasiness. They saw the young vrouw crowding canvas in a futile endeavor to outsail them, whereupon they stood off to starboard and raced on until they were in a position whence they could send a warning shot across her bow. The young vrouw veered, showed them her rudder, and opened fire with her stern chasers. The small shot went whistling through La Foudre's shrouds with some slight damage to her canvas. Followed a brief running fight, in the course of which the Dutchman let fly a broadside. 5 minutes after that they were board and board, the Jongvrouw held tight in the clutches of La Foudre's grapnels, and the buccaneers pouring noisily into her waist. The Dutchman's master, purple in the face, stood forward to beard the pirate, followed closely by an elegant, pale-faced young gentleman, in whom Levasseur recognized his brother-in-law elect. "Captain Levasseur, this is an outrage for which you shall be made to answer. What do you seek aboard my ship?" "At first I sought only that which belongs to me, something of which I am being robbed. But since you chose war and opened fire on me with some damage to my ship, and loss of life to 5 of my men, why, war it is, and your ship a prize of war." From the quarter-rail, Mademoiselle d'Ogeron looked down with glowing eyes in breathless wonder upon her well-beloved hero. Gloriously heroic he seemed as he stood towering there, masterful, audacious, beautiful. He saw her, and with a glad shout sprang towards her. The Dutch master got in his way with hands upheld to arrest his progress. Levasseur did not stay to argue with him. He was too impatient to reach his mistress. He swung the poleaxe that he carried, and the Dutchman went down in blood with a cloven skull. The eager lover stepped across the body and came on, his countenance joyously alight. But Mademoiselle was shrinking now in horror. She was a girl upon the threshold of glorious womanhood, of a fine height and nobly moulded, with heavy coils of glossy black hair above and about a face that was the color of old ivory. Her countenance was cast in lines of arrogance, stressed by the low lids of her full dark eyes. In a bound her well-beloved was beside her. Flinging away his bloody poleaxe, he opened wide his arms to enfold her. But she still shrank, even within his embrace, which would not be denied. A look of dread had come to temper the normal arrogance of her almost perfect face. "Mine, Mine at last, and in spite of it all, he cried exultantly, theatrically, truly heroic. But she, endeavoring to thrust him back, her hands against his breast, could only falter, why did you kill him? He laughed, as a hero should, and answered her heroically, with the tolerance of a god for the mortal to whom he condescends. He stood between us. Let his death be a symbol, a warning. Let all who would stand between us mark it, and beware. It was so splendidly terrific, the gesture of it was so broad and fine, and his magnetism so compelling, that she cast her silly tremors and yielded herself freely, intoxicated, to his fond embrace. Thereafter he swung her to his shoulder, and stepping with ease beneath that burden, bore her in a sort of triumph, lustily cheered by his men, to the deck of his own ship. Her inconsiderate brother might have ruined that romantic scene, but for the watchful Cahusac, who quietly tripped him up, then trussed him like a fowl. Thereafter, what time the captain languished in his lady's smile within the cabin, Cahusac was dealing with the spoils of war. The Dutch crew was ordered into the longboat, and bidden go to the devil. Fortunately, as they numbered fewer than 30, the longboat, though perilously overcrowded, could yet contain them. Next, Cahusac, having inspected the cargo, put a quartermaster and a score of men aboard the Jongvrow, and left her to follow La Foudre, which he now headed south for the Leeward Islands. Cahusac was disposed to be ill-humored. The risk they had run in taking the Dutch brig and doing violence to members of the family of the governor of Tortuga was out of all proportion to the value of their prize. He said so sullenly to Levasseur. "You'll keep that opinion to yourself," the captain answered him. "Don't think I am the man to thrust my neck into a noose without knowing how I am going to take it out again. I shall send an offer of terms to the governor of Tortuga that he will be forced to accept. Set a course for the Virgen Magra. We'll go ashore and settle things from there, and tell them to fetch that milksop Ogeron to the cabin." Levasseur went back to the adoring lady. Thither, too, the lady's brother was presently conducted. The captain rose to receive him, bending his stalwart height to avoid striking the cabin roof with his head. Mademoiselle rose too. "Why this?" she asked Levasseur, pointing to her brother's pinioned wrist, the remains of Cahusac's precautions. "I deplore it," said he. "I desire it to end. Let Monsieur d'Ogeron give me his parole." "I give you nothing," flashed the white-faced youth, who did not lack for spirit. "You see?" Levasseur shrugged his deep regret, and Mademoiselle turned protesting to her brother. "Henri, this is foolish. You are not behaving as my friend. You—" "Little fool," her brother answered her, and the little was out of place. She was the taller of the twain. "Little fool, do you think I should be acting as your friend to make terms with this blackguard pirate?" "Steady, my young cockerel," Levasseur laughed, but his laugh was not nice. "Don't you perceive your wicked folly and the harm it has brought already? Lives have been lost, men have died, that this monster might overtake you, and don't you yet realize where you stand in the power of this beast, of this cur born in a kennel and bred in thieving and murder?" He might have said more, but that Levasseur struck him across the mouth. Levasseur, you see, cared as little as another to hear the truth about himself. Mademoiselle suppressed a scream as the youth staggered back under the blow. He came to rest against a bulkhead and leaned there with bleeding lips. But his spirit was unquenched, and there was a ghastly smile on his white face as his eyes sought his sister's. "You see," he said simply, "he strikes a man whose hands are bound." The simple words, and more than the words, their tone of ineffable disdain, aroused the passion that never slumbered deeply in Levasseur. "And what should you do, puppy, if your hands were unbound?" He took his prisoner by the breast of his doublet and shook him. "Answer me, what should you do? Tchah, you empty windbag, you—" And then came a torrent of words unknown to Mademoiselle, yet of whose foulness her intuitions made her conscious. With blanched cheeks she stood by the cabin table and cried out to Levasseur to stop. To obey her, he opened the door and flung her brother through it. "Put that rubbish under hatches until I call for it again," he roared, and shut the door. Composing himself, he turned to the girl again, with a deprecatory smile, but no smile answered him from her set face. She had seen her beloved hero's nature in curl papers, as it were, and she found the spectacle disgusting and terrifying. It recalled the brutal slaughter of the Dutch captain, and suddenly she realized that what her brother had just said of this man was no more than true. Fear growing to panic was written on her face as she stood there leaning for support against the table. "Why, sweetheart, what is this?" Levasseur moved towards her. She recoiled before him. There was a smile on his face, a glitter in his eyes that fetched her heart into her throat. He caught her as she reached the uttermost limits of the cabin, seized her in his long arms and pulled her to him. "No, no!" she panted. "Yes, yes!" he mocked her, and his mockery was the most terrible thing of all. He crushed her to him brutally, deliberately hurtful because she resisted, and kissed her while she writhed in his embrace. Then, his passion mounting, he grew angry and stripped off the last rag of hero's mask that still may have hung upon his face. "Little fool! Did you not hear your brother say that you are in my power? Remember it, and remember that of your own free will you came. I am not the man with whom a woman can play fast and loose. So get sense, my girl, and accept what you have invited." He kissed her again, almost contemptuously, and flung her off. "No more scowls," he said. "You'll be sorry else." Some one knocked. Cursing the interruption, Levasseur strode off to open. Cahusac stood before him. The Breton's face was grave. He came to report that they had sprung a leak between wind and water, the consequence of damage sustained from one of the Dutchman's shots. In alarm, Levasseur went off with him. The leakage was not serious so long as the weather kept fine, but should a storm overtake them it might speedily become so. A man was slung overboard to make a partial stoppage with a sailcloth, and the pumps were got to work. Ahead of them a low cloud showed on the horizon, which Cahusac pronounced one of the northernmost of the Virgin Islands. "We must run for shelter there and careen her," said Levasseur. "I do not trust this oppressive heat. A storm may catch us before we make land." "A storm or something else," said Cahusac grimly. "Have you noticed that?" He pointed away to starboard. Levasseur looked and caught his breath. Two ships that at the distance seemed of considerable burden were heading towards them some 5 miles away. "If they follow us, what is to happen?" demanded Cahusac. "We'll fight whether we're in case to do so or not," swore Levasseur. "Counsels of despair!" Cahusac was contemptuous. To mark it, he spat upon the deck. "This comes of going to sea with a lovesick madman. Now keep your temper, captain, for the hands will be at the end of theirs if we have trouble as a result of this Dutchman business." For the remainder of that day, Levasseur's thoughts were of anything but love. He remained on deck, his eyes now upon the land, now upon those two slowly gaining ships. To run for the open could avail him nothing, and in his leaky condition would provide an additional danger. He must stand at bay and fight. And then, towards evening, when within 3 miles of shore, and when he was about to give the order to strip for battle, he almost fainted from relief to hear a voice from the crow's nest above announce that the larger of the two ships was the Arabella. Her companion was presumably a prize. But the pessimism of Cahusac abated nothing. "This is but the lesser evil," he growled. "What will Blood say about this Dutchman?" "Let him say what he pleases." Levasseur laughed in the immensity of his relief. "And what about the children of the governor of Tortuga?" "He must not know." "He'll come to know in the end." "Aye, but by then, morbleu, the matter will be settled. I shall have made my peace with the governor. I tell you, I know the way to compel Ogeron to come to terms." Presently the 4 vessels lay to off the northern coast of La Virgen Magra, a narrow little island, arid and treeless, some 12 miles by 3, uninhabited save by birds and turtles, and unproductive of anything but salt, of which there were considerable ponds to the south. Levasseur put off in a boat, accompanied by Cahusac and 2 other officers, and went to visit Captain Blood aboard the Arabella. "Our brief separation has been mighty profitable," was Captain Blood's greeting. "It's a busy morning we've both had." He was in high good humor as he led the way to the great cabin for a rendering of accounts. The tall ship that accompanied the Arabella was a Spanish vessel of 26 guns, the Santiago from Puerto Rico, with 120,000 weight of cacao, 40,000 pieces of 8, and the value of 10,000 more in jewels, a rich capture of which 2/5 under the articles went to Levasseur and his crew. Of the money and jewels a division was made on the spot. The cacao, it was agreed, should be taken to Tortuga to be sold. Then it was the turn of Levasseur, and black grew the brow of Captain Blood as the Frenchman's tale was unfolded. At the end he roundly expressed his disapproval. The Dutch were a friendly people whom it was a folly to alienate, particularly for so paltry a matter as these hides and tobacco, which at most would fetch a bare 20,000 pieces. But Levasseur answered him, as he had answered Cahusac, that a ship was a ship, and it was ships they needed against their projected enterprise. Perhaps because things had gone well with him that day, Blood ended by shrugging the matter aside. Thereupon Levasseur proposed that the Arabella and her prize should return to Tortuga, there to unload the cacao and enlist the further adventurers that could now be shipped. Levasseur, meanwhile, would effect certain necessary repairs, and then, proceeding south, await his admiral at Saltatudos, an island conveniently situated in the latitude of 11 degrees 11 minutes north, for their enterprise against Maracaibo. To Levasseur's relief, Captain Blood not only agreed, but pronounced himself ready to set sail at once. No sooner had the Arabella departed than Levasseur brought his ships into the lagoon and set his crew to work upon the erection of temporary quarters ashore for himself, his men, and his enforced guests, during the careening and repairing of La Foudre. At sunset that evening the wind freshened. It grew to a gale, and from that to such a hurricane that Levasseur was thankful to find himself ashore and his ships in safe shelter. He wondered a little how it might be faring with Captain Blood out there at the mercy of that terrific storm, but he did not permit concern to trouble him unduly. End of section 14. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Captain Blood by Rafael Sabatini. Section 15. The Ransom. In the glory of the following morning, sparkling and clear after the storm, with an invigorating briny tang in the air from the salt ponds on the south of the island, a curious scene was played on the beach of the Virgen Magra, at the foot of a ridge of bleached dunes, beside the spread of sail from which Levasseur had improvised a tent. Enthroned upon an empty cask sat the French filibuster to transact important business, the business of making himself safe with the governor of Tortuga. A guard of honor of a half-dozen officers hung about him. 5 of them were rude boucan hunters, in stained jerkins and leather breeches. The 6th was Cahusac. Before him, guarded by 2 half-naked negroes, stood young d'Ogeron, in frilled shirt and satin small-clothes and fine shoes of Cordovan leather. He was stripped of doublet, and his hands were tied behind him. The young gentleman's comely face was haggard. Near at hand, and also under guard, but unpinioned, Mademoiselle his sister sat hunched upon a hillock of sand. She was very pale, and it was in vain that she sought to veil in a mask of arrogance the fears by which she was assailed. Levasseur addressed himself to M. d'Ogeron. He spoke at long length. In the end, "I trust, monsieur," said he, with mock suavity, "that I have made myself quite clear. So that there may be no misunderstandings, I will recapitulate. Your ransom is fixed at 20,000 pieces of 8, and you shall have liberty on parole to go to Tortuga to collect it. In fact, I shall provide the means to convey you thither, and you shall have a month in which to come and go. Meanwhile, your sister remains with me as a hostage. Your father should not consider such a sum excessive as the price of his son's liberty, and to provide a dowry for his daughter. Indeed, if anything, I am too modest. Pardi, Monsieur d'Ogeron is reputed a wealthy man." Monsieur d'Ogeron the younger raised his head and looked the captain boldly in the face. "I refuse utterly and absolutely, do you understand? So do your worst, and be damned for a filthy pirate without decency and without honor." "But what words!" laughed Levasseur. "What heat, and what foolishness! You have not considered the alternative. When you do, you will not persist in your refusal. You will not do that in any case. We have spurs for the reluctant, and I warn you against giving me your parole under stress, and afterwards playing me false. I shall know how to find and punish you. Meanwhile, remember your sister's honor is in pawn to me. Should you forget to return with the dowry, you will not consider it unreasonable that I forget to marry her." Levasseur's smiling eyes, intent upon the young man's face, saw the horror that crept into his glance. M. d'Ogeron cast a wild glance at Mademoiselle, and observed the gray despair that had almost stamped the beauty from her face. Disgust and fury swept across his countenance. Then he braced himself and answered resolutely, "No, you dog, 1,000 times no! You are foolish to persist." Levasseur spoke without anger, with a cold, mocking regret. His fingers had been busy tying knots in a length of whipcord. He held it up. "You know this? It is a rosary of pain that has wrought the conversion of many a stubborn heretic. It is capable of screwing the eyes out of a man's head by way of helping him to see reason. As you please." He flung the length of knotted cord to one of the negroes, who in an instant made it fast about the prisoner's brows. Then between cord and cranium the black inserted a short length of metal, round and slender as a pipe stem. That done, he rolled his eyes toward Levasseur, awaiting the captain's signal. Levasseur considered his victim, and beheld him tense and braced, his haggard face of a leaden hue, beads of perspiration glinting on his pallid brow just beneath the whipcord. Mademoiselle cried out, and would have risen, but her guards restrained her, and she sank down again, moaning. "I beg that you will spare yourself and your sister," said the captain, "by being reasonable. What, after all, is the sum I have named? To your wealthy father, a bagatelle. I repeat, I have been too modest. But since I have said 20,000 pieces of 8, 20,000 pieces it shall be." "And for what, if you please, have you said 20,000 pieces of 8? In execrable French, but in a voice that was crisp and pleasant, seeming to echo some of the mockery that had invested Levasseur's, that question floated over their heads. Startled, Levasseur and his officers looked up and around. On the crest of the dunes behind them, in sharp silhouette against the deep cobalt of the sky, they beheld a tall, lean figure, scrupulously dressed in black with silver lace, a crimson ostrich plume curled about the broad brim of his hat, affording the only touch of color. Under that hat was the tawny face of Captain Blood. Levasseur gathered himself up with an oath of amazement. He had conceived Captain Blood by now well below the horizon, on his way to Tortuga, assuming him to have been so fortunate as to have weathered last night's storm. Launching himself upon the yielding sand, into which he sank to the level of the calves of his fine boots of Spanish leather, Captain Blood came sliding erect to the beach. He was followed by Wolverstone and a dozen others. As he came to a standstill, he doffed his hat with a flourish to the lady. Then he turned to Levasseur. "Good morning, my captain," said he, and proceeded to explain his presence. "It was last night's hurricane compelled our return. We had no choice but to ride before it with stripped poles, and it drove us back the way we had gone. Moreover, as the devil would have it, the Santiago sprang her mainmast, and so I was glad to put into a cove on the west of the island a couple miles away, and we've walked across to stretch our legs, and to give you good day. But who are these?" And he designated the man and the woman. Cahusac shrugged his shoulders, and tossed his long arms to heaven. "Voilà!" said he pregnantly to the firmament. Levasseur gnawed his lip, and changed color, but he controlled himself to answer civilly. "As you see, 2 prisoners. Ah! Washed ashore in last night's gale, eh?" "Not so." Levasseur contained himself with difficulty before that irony. "They were in the Dutch brig." "I don't remember that you mentioned them before." "I did not. They are prisoners of my own. A personal matter. They are French." "French?" Captain Blood's eyes stabbed at Levasseur, then at the prisoners. M. d'Ogeron stood tense and braced as before, but the gray horror had left his face. Hope had leapt within him at this interruption, obviously as little expected by his tormentor as by himself. His sister, moved by a similar intuition, was leaning forward with parted lips and gaping eyes. Captain Blood fingered his lip and frowned thoughtfully upon Levasseur. "Yesterday you surprised me by making war upon the friendly Dutch, but now it seems that not even your own countrymen are safe from you. Have I not said that this is a matter personal to me? Ah, and their names? Captain Blood's crisp, authoritative, faintly disdainful manner stirred Levasseur's quick anger. The blood crept slowly back into his bleached face, and his glance grew in insolence, almost in menace. Meanwhile the prisoner answered for him. I am Henri d'Ogeron, and this is my sister. D'Ogeron? Captain Blood stared. Are you related by chance to my good friend, the governor of Tortuga? He is my father. Levasseur swung aside with an imprecation. In Captain Blood, amazement for the moment quenched every other emotion. The saints preserve us now! Are you quite mad, Levasseur? First you molest the Dutch, who are our friends. Next you take prisoners 2 persons that are French, your own countrymen. And now, faith, they're no less than the children of the governor of Tortuga, which is the one safe place of shelter that we enjoy in these islands. Levasseur broke in angrily. Must I tell you again that this is a matter personal to me? I make myself alone responsible to the governor of Tortuga. And the 20,000 pieces of 8? Is that also a matter personal to you? It is. Now I don't agree with you at all. Captain Blood sat down on the cask that Levasseur had lately occupied and looked up blandly. I may inform you, to save time, that I heard the entire proposal that you made to this lady and this gentleman, and I'll also remind you that we sail under articles that admit no ambiguities. You have fixed their ransom at 20,000 pieces of 8. That sum then belongs to your crews and mine, in the proportions by the articles established. You'll hardly wish to dispute it. But what is far more grave is that you have concealed from me this part of the prizes taken on your last cruise. And for such an offence as that, the articles provide certain penalties that are somewhat severe in character. Ho, ho, laughed Levasseur unpleasantly, then added, if you dislike my conduct, we can dissolve the association. That is my intention, but we'll dissolve it when and in the manner that I choose, and that will be as soon as you have satisfied the articles under which we sailed upon this cruise. What do you mean? I'll be as short as I can, said Captain Blood. I'll waive for the moment the unseemliness of making war upon the Dutch, of taking French prisoners, and of provoking the anger of the governor of Tortuga. I'll accept the situation as I find it. Yourself, you've fixed the ransom of this couple at 20,000 pieces, and as I gather, the lady is to be your perquisite. But why should she be your perquisite more than another's, seeing that she belongs by the articles to all of us, as a prize of war? Black as thunder grew the brow of Levasseur. However, added Captain Blood, I'll not dispute her to you if you are prepared to buy her. Buy her? At the price you have set upon her. Levasseur contained his rage, that he might reason with the Irishman. That is the ransom of the man. It is to be paid for him by the governor of Tortuga. No, no, ye've parcelled the twain together. Very oddly, I confess. Ye've set their value at 20,000 pieces, and for that sum you may have them, since you desire it, but you'll pay for them the 20,000 pieces that are ultimately to come to you, as the ransom of one and the dowry of the other, and that sum shall be divided among our crews. So that you do that, it is conceivable that our followers may take a lenient view of your breach of the articles we jointly signed. Levasseur laughed savagely. Ha, ça, creux Dieu, the good jest. I quite agree with you, said Captain Blood. To Levasseur the jest lay in that Captain Blood, with no more than a dozen followers, should come there attempting to hector him, who had 100 men within easy call. But it seemed that he had left out of his reckoning something which his opponent had counted in. For, as laughing still, Levasseur swung to his officers, he saw that which choked the laughter in his throat. Captain Blood had shrewdly played upon the cupidity that was the paramount inspiration of those adventurers, and Levasseur now read clearly on their faces how completely they adopted Captain Blood's suggestion that all must participate in the ransom which their leader had thought to appropriate to himself. It gave the gaudy ruffian pause, and whilst in his heart he cursed those followers of his who could be faithful only to their greed, he perceived, and only just in time, that he had best tread warily. You misunderstand, he said, swallowing his rage. The ransom is for division when it comes. The girl, meanwhile, is mine on that understanding. Good, grunted Cahusac. On that understanding all arranges itself. You think so? Said Captain Blood. But if Monsieur d'Ogeron should refuse to pay the ransom, what then? He laughed, and got lazily to his feet. No, no. If Captain Levasseur is meanwhile to keep the girl, as he proposes, then let him pay this ransom, and be his the risk if it should afterwards not be forthcoming. That's it, cried one of Levasseur's officers, and Cahusac added, It's reasonable that. Captain Blood is right. It is in the articles. What is in the articles, you fools? Levasseur was in danger of losing his head. Sacre Dieu! Where do you suppose that I have 20,000 pieces? My whole share of the prizes of this cruise does not come to half that sum. I'll be your debtor until I've earned it. Will that content you? All things considered, there is not a doubt that it would have done so, had not Captain Blood intended otherwise. And if you should die before you've earned it? Ours is a calling fraught with risks, my captain. Damn you! Levasseur flung upon him livid with fury. Will nothing satisfy you? Oh, but yes, 20,000 pieces of 8 for immediate division. I haven't got it. Then let someone buy the prisoners who has. And who do you suppose has it if I have not? I have, said Captain Blood. You have? Levasseur's mouth fell open. You want the girl? Why not? And I exceed you in gallantry in that I will make sacrifices to obtain her, and in honesty in that I am ready to pay for what I want. Levasseur stared at him foolishly agape. Behind him pressed his officers, gaping also. Captain Blood sat down again on the cask, and drew from an inner pocket of his doublet a little leather bag. I am glad to be able to resolve a difficulty that at one moment seemed insoluble. And under the bulging eyes of Levasseur and his officers, he untied the mouth of the bag, and rolled into his left palm 4 or 5 pearls, each of the size of a sparrow's egg. There were 20 such in the bag, the very pick of those taken in that raid upon the pearl fleet. You boast a knowledge of pearls, Cahusac. At what do you value this? The Breton took between coarse finger and thumb the proffered, lustrous, delicately iridescent sphere, his shrewd eyes appraising it. 1,000 pieces, he answered shortly. It will fetch rather more in Tortuga or Jamaica, said Captain Blood, and twice as much in Europe. But I'll accept your valuation. They are almost of a size, as you can see. Here are 12, representing 12,000 pieces of 8, which is La Foudre's share of 3/5 of the prize, as provided by the articles. For the 8,000 pieces that go to the Arabella, I make myself responsible to my own men. And now, Wolverstone, if you please, will you take my property aboard the Arabella? He stood up again, indicating the prisoners. Ah, no! Levasseur threw wide the floodgates of his fury. Ah, that, no, by example, you shall not take her. He would have sprung upon Captain Blood, who stood aloof, alert, tight-lipped, and watchful. But it was one of Levasseur's own officers who hindered him. Nom de Dieu, mon capitaine, what will you do? It is settled, honorably settled, with satisfaction to all. To all? blazed Levasseur. Ah, ça! To all of you, you animals, but what of me? Cahusac, with the pearls clutched in his capacious hand, stepped up to him on the other side. Don't be a fool, Captain. Do you want to provoke trouble between the crews? His men outnumber us by nearly 2 to 1. What's a girl, more or less? In heaven's name, let her go. He's paid handsomely for her, and dealt fairly with us. Dealt fairly? Roared the infuriated captain. You... In all his foul vocabulary he could find no epithet to describe his lieutenant. He caught him a blow that almost sent him sprawling. The pearls were scattered in the sand. Cahusac dived after them, his fellows with him. Vengeance must wait. For some moments they groped there on hands and knees, oblivious of all else. And yet in those moments vital things were happening. Levasseur, his hand on his sword, his face a white mask of rage, was confronting Captain Blood to hinder his departure. You do not take her while I live, he cried. Then I'll take her when you're dead, said Captain Blood, and his own blade flashed in the sunlight. The articles provide that any man of whatever rank, concealing any part of a prize, be it of the value of no more than a peso, shall be hanged at the yardarm. It's what I intended for you in the end, but since ye prefer this way, ye muckrake, faith, I'll be humoring you." He waved away the men who would have interfered, and the blades rang together. Monsieur d'Ogeron looked on, a man bemused, unable to surmise what the issue either way could mean for him. Meanwhile, two of Blood's men, who had taken the place of the Frenchman's negro guards, had removed the crown of whipcord from his brow. As for mademoiselle, she had risen, and was leaning forward, a hand pressed tightly to her heaving breast, her face deathly pale, a wild terror in her eyes. It was soon over. The brute strength upon which Levasseur so confidently counted could avail nothing against the Irishman's practised skill. When, with both lungs transfixed, he lay prone on the white sand, coughing out his rascally life, Captain Blood looked calmly at Cahusac across the body. "I think that cancels the articles between us," he said. With soulless, cynical eyes, Cahusac considered the twitching body of his recent leader. Had Levasseur been a man of different temper, the affair might have ended in a very different manner. But then it is certain that Captain Blood would have adopted in dealing with him different tactics. As it was, Levasseur commanded neither love nor loyalty. The men who followed him were the very dregs of that vile trade, and cupidity was their only inspiration. Upon that cupidity Captain Blood had deftly played, until he had brought them to find Levasseur guilty of the one offence they deemed unpardonable, the crime of appropriating to himself something which might be converted into gold and shared amongst them all. Thus, now the threatening mob of buccaneers that came hastening to the theatre of that swift tragi-comedy were appeased by a dozen words of Cahusac's. Whilst they hesitated, Blood added something to quicken their decision. "If you will come to our anchorage, you shall receive at once your share of the booty of the Santiago, which you may dispose of as you please." They crossed the island, the two prisoners accompanying them, and later that day, the division made, they would have parted company, but that Cahusac, at the instances of the men who had elected him Levasseur's successor, offered Captain Blood anew the services of that French contingent. "If you will sail with me again," the captain answered him, "you may do so on the condition that you make your peace with the Dutch and restore the brig and her cargo." The condition was accepted, and Captain Blood went off to find his guests, the children of Governor Tortuga. Mademoiselle d'Ogeron and her brother, the latter now relieved of his bonds, sat in the great cabin of the Arabella, whither they had been conducted. Wine and food had been placed upon the table by Benjamin, Captain Blood's negro steward and cook, who had intimated to them that it was for their entertainment, but it had remained untouched. Brother and sister sat there in agonized bewilderment, conceiving that their escape was but from frying-pan to fire. At length, overwrought by the suspense, Mademoiselle flung herself upon her knees before her brother to implore his pardon for all the evil brought upon them by her wicked folly. Monsieur d'Ogeron was not in a forgiving mood. "I am glad that at least you realize what you have done. And now this other filibuster has bought you, and you belong to him. You realize that too, I hope." He might have said more, but he checked upon perceiving that the door was opening. Captain Blood, coming from settling matters with the followers of Levasseur, stood on the threshold. Monsieur d'Ogeron had not troubled to restrain his high-pitched voice, and the captain had overheard the Frenchman's last two sentences. Therefore, he perfectly understood why Mademoiselle should bound up at the sight of him and shrink back in fear. "Mademoiselle," said he in his vile but fluent French, "I beg you to dismiss your fears. Aboard this ship you shall be treated with all honor. So soon as we are in case to put to sea again, we steer a course for Tortuga to take you home to your father. And pray do not consider that I have bought you, as your brother has just said. All I have done has been to provide the ransom necessary to bribe a gang of scoundrels to depart from obedience to the arch-scoundrel who commanded them, and so deliver you from all peril. Count it, if you please, a friendly loan, to be repaid entirely at your convenience." Mademoiselle stared at him in unbelief. Monsieur d'Ogeron rose to his feet. "Monsieur, is it possible that you are serious?" "I am." "It may not happen often nowadays. I may be a pirate, but my ways are not the ways of Levasseur, who should have stayed in Europe and practised purse-cutting. I have a sort of honour, shall we say some rags of honour, remaining me from better days." Then, on a brisker note, he added, "We dine in an hour, and I trust that you will honour my table with your company. Meanwhile, Benjamin will see, monsieur, that you are more suitably provided in the matter of wardrobe." He bowed to them and turned to depart again, but mademoiselle detained him. "Monsieur!" she cried sharply. He checked and turned, while slowly she approached him, regarding him between dread and wonder. "Oh, you are noble!" "I shouldn't put it as high as that myself," said he. You are, and it is but right that you should know all." "Madelon!" her brother cried out to restrain her. But she would not be restrained. Her surcharged heart must overflow in confidence. "Monsieur, for what befell, I am greatly at fault. This man, this Levasseur—" He stared incredulous in his turn. "My God, is it possible? That animal?" Abruptly she fell on her knees, caught his hand and kissed it before he could wrench it from her. "What do you do?" he cried. "En amende. In my mind I dishonoured you by deeming you his like, by conceiving your fight with Levasseur a combat between jackals. On my knees, monsieur, I implore you to forgive me." Captain Blood looked down upon her, and a smile broke on his lips, irradiating the blue eyes that looked so oddly light in that tawny face. "Why, child," said he, "I might find it hard to forgive you the stupidity of having thought otherwise." As he handed her to her feet again, he assured himself that he had behaved rather well in the affair. Then he sighed. That dubious fame of his that had spread so quickly across the Caribbean would by now have reached the ears of Arabella Bishop. That she would despise him he could not doubt, deeming him no better than all the other scoundrels who drove this villainous buccaneering trade. Therefore he hoped that some echo of this deed might reach her also, and be set by her against some of that contempt. For the whole truth, which he withheld from Mademoiselle d'Ogeron, was that in venturing his life to save her, he had been driven by the thought that the deed must be pleasing in the eyes of Miss Bishop, could she but witness it. End of section 15.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Murphy. Captain Blood by Rafael Sabatini. Chapter 16. That affair of Mademoiselle d'Ogeron bore as its natural fruit an improvement in the already cordial relations between Captain Blood and the governor of Tortuga. At the fine stone house with its green jalousied windows, which Monsieur d'Ogeron had built himself in a spacious and luxuriant garden to the east of Cayona, the captain became a very welcome guest. Monsieur d'Ogeron was in the captain's debt for more than the 20,000 pieces of 8 which he had provided for Mademoiselle's ransom, and shrewd, hard bargain driver though he might be, the Frenchman could be generous and understood the sentiment of gratitude. This he now proved in every possible way, and under his powerful protection the credit of Captain Blood among the buccaneers very rapidly reached its zenith. So when it came to fitting out his fleet for that enterprise against Maracaibo, which had originally been Levasseur's project, he did not want for either ships or men to follow him. He recruited 500 adventurers in all, and he might have had as many thousands if he could have offered them accommodation. Similarly, without difficulty, he might have increased his fleet to twice its strength of ships, but that he preferred to keep it what it was. The 3 vessels to which he confined it were the Arabella, the La Foudre, which Cahusac now commanded, with a contingent of some 60 Frenchmen, and the Santiago, which had been refitted and rechristened the Elizabeth, after that Queen of England, whose seamen had humbled Spain, as Captain Blood now hoped to humble it again. Hagthorpe, in virtue of his service in the navy, was appointed by Blood to commander, and the appointment was confirmed by the men. It was some months after the rescue of Mademoiselle d'Ogeron in August of that year 1687, that this little fleet, after some minor adventures, which I pass over in silence, sailed into the great lake of Maracaibo, and effected its raid upon that opulent city of the Main. The affair did not proceed exactly as was hoped, and Blood's force came to find itself in a precarious position. This is best explained in the words employed by Cahusac, which Pitt has carefully recorded. In the course of an altercation that broke out on the steps of the church of Nuestra Senora del Carmen, which Captain Blood had impiously appropriated for the purpose of a corps de garde. I have said already that he was a papist only when it suited him. The dispute was being conducted by Hagthorpe, Wolverstone, and Pitt on the one side, and Cahusac, out of whose uneasiness it all arose, on the other. Behind them, in the sun-scorched, dusty square, sparsely fringed by palms, whose fronds drooped listlessly in the quivering heat, surged a couple of hundred wild fellows belonging to both parties, their own excitement momentarily quelled, so that they might listen to what passed among their leaders. Cahusac appeared to be having it all his own way, and he raised his harsh, querulous voice so that all might hear his truculent denunciation. He spoke, Pitt tells us, a dreadful kind of English, which the shipmaster, however, makes little attempt to reproduce. His dress was as discordant as his speech. It was of a kind to advertise his trade, and ludicrously in contrast with the sober garb of Hagthorpe and the almost foppish daintiness of Jeremy Pitt. His soiled and blood-stained shirt of blue cotton was open in front, to cool his hairy breast, and the girdle about the waist of his leather breeches carried an arsenal of pistols and a knife, whilst a cutlass hung from a leather baldric loosely slung about his body. Above his countenance, broad and flat as a Mongolian's, a red scarf was swathed, turban-wise, about his head. "Is it that I have not warned you from the beginning that all was too easy?" he demanded, between plaintiveness and fury. "I am no fool, my friends. I have eyes, me, and I see. I see an abandoned fort at the entrance of the lake, and nobody there to fire a gun at us when we came in. Then I suspect the trap. Who would not that had eyes and brain? Bah! We come on. What do we find? A city, abandoned like the fort. A city out of which the people have taken all things of value. Again I warn Captain Blood. It is a trap, I say. We are to come on, always to come on without opposition, until we find that it is too late to go to sea again, that we cannot go back at all. But no one will listen to me. You all know so much more. Name of God! Captain Blood, he will go on, and we go on. We go to Gibraltar. True that at last, after a long time, we catch the Deputy Governor. True, we make him pay big ransom for Gibraltar. True, between that ransom and the loot, we return here with some 2,000 pieces of eight. But what is it in reality, will you tell me? Or shall I tell you? It is a piece of cheese in a mousetrap, and we are the little mice. Goddam, and the cats, oh, the cats, they wait for us. The cats are those 4 Spanish ships of war that have come meantime, and they wait for us outside the bottleneck of this lagoon. Mort de Dieu, that is what comes of the damned obstinacy of your fine Captain Blood." Wolverstone laughed. Cahusac exploded in fury. "Ah, sang Dieu, tu gris animal! You laugh! Tell me this. How do we get out again unless we accept the terms of Monsieur the Admiral of Spain?" From the buccaneers at the foot of the steps came an angry rumble of approval. The single eye of the gigantic Wolverstone rolled terribly, and he clenched his great fists as if to strike the Frenchman, who was exposing them to mutiny. But Cahusac was not daunted. The mood of the men enheartened him. "You think, perhaps, this your Captain Blood is the good God, that he can make miracles, eh? He is ridiculous, you know, this Captain Blood, with his grand air and his—" He checked. Out of the church at that moment, grand air and all, sauntered Peter Blood. With him came a tough, long-legged French sea-wolf named Iberville, who, though still young, had already won fame as a privateer commander before the loss of his own ship had driven him to take service under Blood. The captain advanced towards that disputing group, leaning lightly upon his long ebony cane, his face shaded by a broad-plumed hat. There was in his appearance nothing of the buccaneer. He had much more the air of a lounger in the Mall or the Alameda. The latter rather, since his elegant suit of violet taffetas with gold-embroidered buttonholes was in the Spanish fashion. But the long, stout, serviceable rapier, thrust up behind by the left hand resting lightly on the pommel, corrected the impression. That and those steely eyes of his announced the adventurer. "You find me ridiculous, eh, Cahusac?" said he, as he came to a halt before the Breton, whose anger seemed already to have gone out of him. "What, then, must I find you?" He spoke quietly, almost wearily. "You will be telling them that we have delayed, and that it is the delay that has brought about our danger. But whose is the fault of that delay? We have been a month in doing what should have been done, and what but for your blundering would have been done inside of a week." "Ascar, nom de Dieu! Was it my fault that—" "Was it anyone's fault that you ran your ship La Foudre aground on the shoal in the middle of the lake? You would not be piloted. You knew your way. You took no soundings even. The result was that we lost 3 precious days in getting canoes to bring off your men and your gear. Those 3 days gave the folk at Gibraltar not only time to hear of our coming, but time in which to get away. After that, and because of it, we had to follow the governor to his infernal island fortress, and a fortnight and best part of 100 lives were lost in reducing it. That's how we come to have delayed until this Spanish fleet is fetched round from La Guaira by a guarda-costa. And if ye hadn't lost La Foudre, and so reduced our fleet from 3 ships to 2, we should even now be able to fight our way through with a reasonable hope of succeeding. Yet you think it is for you to come hectoring here, upbraiding us for a situation that is just the result of your own ineptitude?" He spoke with a restraint, which I trust you will agree was admirable, when I tell you that the Spanish fleet guarding the bottleneck exit of the great lake of Maracaibo, and waiting there the coming forth of Captain Blood, with a calm confidence based upon its overwhelming strength, was commanded by his implacable enemy, Don Miguel de Espinosa y Valdez, the Admiral of Spain. In addition to his duty to his country, the Admiral had, as you know, a further personal incentive arising out of that business aboard the Encarnacion a year ago, and the death of his brother, Don Diego, and with him sailed his nephew Esteban, whose vindictive zeal exceeded the Admiral's own. Yet knowing all this, Captain Blood could preserve his calm in reproving the cowardly frenzy of one for whom the situation had not half the peril with which it was fraught for himself. He turned from Cahusac to address the mob of buccaneers, who had surged nearer to hear him, for he had not troubled to raise his voice. "I hope that will correct some of the misapprehension that appears to have been disturbing you," said he. "There's no good can come of talking of what's past and done," cried Cahusac, more sullen now than truculent. Whereupon Wolverstone laughed, a laugh that was like the neighing of a horse. "The question is, what are we to do now?" "Sure now, there's no question at all," said Captain Blood. "Indeed, but there is," Cahusac insisted. "Don Miguel, the Spanish admiral, has offered us safe passage to sea if we will depart at once, do no damage to the town, release our prisoners, and surrender all that we took at Gibraltar." Captain Blood smiled quietly, knowing precisely how much Don Miguel's word was worth. It was Iberville who replied, in manifest scorn of his compatriot. "Which argues that, even at this disadvantage as he has us, the Spanish admiral is still afraid of us." "That can only be because he doesn't know our real weakness," was the fierce retort. "And anyway, we must accept these terms. We have no choice. That is my opinion." "Well, it's not mine now," said Captain Blood, "so I've refused them." "Refuse?" Cahusac's broad face grew purple. A muttering from the men behind him heartened him. "You have refused? You have refused? Already, and without consulting me?" "Your disagreement could have altered nothing. You'd have been outvoted, for Hagthorpe here was entirely of my own mind. Still," he went on, "if you and your own French followers wish to avail yourselves of the Spaniard's terms, we shall not hinder you. Send one of your prisoners to announce it to the Admiral. Don Miguel will welcome your decision, you may be sure." Cahusac glowered at him in silence for a moment. Then, having controlled himself, he asked in a concentrated voice, "Precisely what answer have you made to the Admiral?" A smile irradiated the face and eyes of Captain Blood. "I have answered him that unless, within 24 hours, we have his parole to stand out to sea, ceasing to dispute our passage or hinder our departure, and a ransom of 50,000 pieces of 8 for Maracaibo, we shall reduce this beautiful city to ashes, and thereafter go out and destroy his fleet." The impudence of it left Cahusac speechless, but among the English buccaneers in the square there were many who savoured the audacious humour of the trapped dictating terms to the trappers. Laughter broke from them. It spread into a roar of acclamation, for bluff is a weapon dear to every adventurer. Presently, when they understood it, even Cahusac's French followers were carried off their feet by that wave of jocular enthusiasm, until in his truculent obstinacy Cahusac remained the only dissentient. He withdrew in mortification. Nor was he to be mollified until the following day brought him his revenge. This came in the shape of a messenger from Don Miguel, with a letter in which the Spanish admiral solemnly vowed to God that, since the pirates had refused his magnanimous offer to permit them to surrender with the honours of war, he would now await them at the mouth of the lake, there to destroy them on their coming forth. He added that should they delay their departure, he would, so soon as he was reinforced by a 5th ship, the Santo Nino, on its way to join him from La Guaira, himself come inside to seek them at Maracaibo. This time Captain Blood was put out of temper. "Trouble me no more," he snapped at Cahusac, who came growling to him again. "Send word to Don Miguel that you have seceded from me. He'll give you safe conduct, devil a doubt. Then take one of the sloops, order your men aboard, and put to sea, and the devil go with you." Cahusac would certainly have adopted that course if only his men had been unanimous in the matter. They, however, were torn between greed and apprehension. If they went, they must abandon their share of the plunder, which was considerable, as well as the slaves and other prisoners they had taken. If they did this, and Captain Blood should afterwards contrive to get away unscathed, and from their knowledge of his resourcefulness, the thing, however unlikely, need not be impossible, he must profit by that which they now relinquished. This was a contingency too bitter for contemplation. And so, in the end, despite all that Cahusac could say, the surrender was not to Don Miguel, but to Peter Blood. They had come into the venture with him, they asserted, and they would go out of it with him or not at all. That was the message he received from them that same evening by the sullen mouth of Cahusac himself. He welcomed it, and invited the Breton to sit down and join the council, which was even then deliberating upon the means to be employed. This council occupied the spacious patio of the governor's house, which Captain Blood had appropriated to his own uses. A cloistered stone quadrangle, in the middle of which a fountain played coolly under a trellis of vine. Orange trees grew on 2 sides of it, and the still evening air was heavy with the scent of them. It was one of those pleasant exterior interiors which Moorish architects had introduced to Spain, and the Spaniards had carried with them to the New World. Here that council of war, composed of 6 men in all, deliberated until late that night upon the plan of action which Captain Blood put forward. The great freshwater lake of Maracaibo, nourished by a score of rivers from the snow-capped ranges that surround it on 2 sides, is some 120 miles in length, and almost the same distance across at its widest. It is, as has been indicated, in the shape of a great bottle, having its neck towards the sea at Maracaibo. Beyond this neck it widens again, and then the two long, narrow strips of land, known as the islands of Vigilalis and Palamas, block the channel, standing lengthwise across it. The only passage out to sea for vessels of any draught lies in the narrow strait between these islands. Palomas, which is some 10 miles in length, is unapproachable for half a mile on either side by any but the shallowest craft, save at its eastern end, where, completely commanding the narrow passage out to sea, stands the massive fort which the buccaneers had found deserted upon their coming. In the broader water between this passage and the bar, the 4 Spanish ships were at anchor in mid-channel. The Admiral's Encarnacion, which we already know, was a mighty galleon of 48 great guns and 8 small. Next in importance was the Salvador, with 36 guns. The other 2, the Infanta and the San Felipe, though smaller vessels, were still formidable enough with their 20 guns and 150 men apiece. Such was the fleet of which the gauntlet was to be run by Captain Blood, with his own Arabella of 40 guns, the Elizabeth of 26, and 2 sloops captured at Gibraltar, which they had indifferently armed with 4 culverins each. In men they had a bare 400 survivors of the 500-odd that had left Tortuga, to oppose a fully 1,000 Spaniards manning the galleons. The plan of action submitted by Captain Blood to that council was a desperate one, as Cahusac uncompromisingly pronounced it. "Why, so it is," said the captain. "But I've done things more desperate." Complacently he pulled at a pipe that was loaded with that fragrant sacerdote's tobacco for which Gibraltar was famous, and of which they had brought away some hogsheads. And what is more, they succeeded. Audaces fortuna juvat. Bedad, they knew their world, the old Romans. He breathed into his companion, and even into Cahusac, some of his own spirit of confidence, and in confidence all went busily to work. For 3 days, from sunrise to sunset, the buccaneers laboured and sweated to complete the preparations for the action that was to procure them their deliverance. Time pressed. They must strike before Don Miguel de Espinosa received the reinforcement of that 5th galleon, the Santo Nino, which was coming to join him from La Guarda. Their principal operations were on the larger of the 2 sloops captured at Gibraltar, to which vessel was assigned the leading part in Captain Blood's scheme. They began by tearing down all bulkheads until they had reduced her to the merest shell, and in her sides they broke open so many ports that her gunwale was converted into the semblance of a grating. Next they increased by 6 the scuttles in her deck, whilst into her hull they packed all the tar and pitch and brimstone that they could find in the town, to which they added 6 barrels of gunpowder, placed on end like guns at the open ports on the larboard side. On the evening of the 4th day, everything being now in readiness, all were got aboard, and the empty, pleasant city of Maracaibo was at last abandoned. But they did not weigh anchor until some 2 hours after midnight. Then, at last, on the first of the ebb, they drifted silently down towards the bar, with all canvas furled, save only their split sails, which, so as to give them steering way, were spread to the faint breeze that stirred through the purple darkness of the tropical night. The order of their going was as follows. Ahead went the improvised fireship in charge of Wolverstone, with a crew of 6 volunteers, each of whom was to have 100 pieces of 8 over and above his share of plunder as a special reward. Next came the Arabella. She was followed at a distance by the Elizabeth, commanded by Hagthorpe, with whom was the now shipless Cahusac and the bulk of his French followers. The rear was brought up by the 2nd sloop and some 8 canoes, aboard of which had been shipped the prisoners, the slaves, and most of the captured merchandise. The prisoners were all pinioned and guarded by 4 buccaneers with musketoons, who manned these boats in addition to the 2 fellows who were to sail them. Their place was to be in the rear, and they were to take no part whatever in the coming fight. At the first glimmerings of opalescent dawn dissolved the darkness, the straining eyes of the buccaneers were able to make out the tall rigging of the Spanish vessels. riding at anchor less than a quarter of a mile ahead. Entirely without suspicion, as the Spaniards were, and rendered confident by their own overwhelming strength, it is unlikely that they used a vigilance keener than their careless habit. Certain it is that they did not sight Blood's fleet in that dim light until Blood's fleet had sighted them. By the time that they had actively roused themselves, Wolverstone's sloop was almost upon them, speeding under canvas, which had been crowded to her yards the moment the galleons had loomed into view. Straight for the Admiral's great ship, the Encarnacion, did Wolverstone head the sloop. Then, lashing down the helm, he kindled from a match that hung ready lighted beside him a great torch of thickly plated straw that had been steeped in bitumen. First it glowed. Then, as he swung it round his head, it burst into flame, just as the slight vessel went crashing and bumping and scraping against the side of the flagship, whilst rigging became tangled with rigging, to the straining of yards and snapping of spars overhead. His 6 men stood at their posts on the larboard side, stark naked, each armed with a grapnel, 4 of them on the gunwale, 2 of them aloft. At the moment of impact, these grapnels were slung to bind the Spaniard to them, those aloft being intended to complete and preserve the entanglement of the rigging. Aboard the rudely awakened galleon all was confused hurrying, scurrying, trumpeting, and shouting. At first there had been a desperately hurried attempt to get up the anchor, but this was abandoned as being already too late, and conceiving themselves on the point of being boarded, the Spaniards stood to arms to ward off the onslaught. Its slowness in coming intrigued them, being so different from the usual tactics of the buccaneers. Further intrigued were they by the sight of the gigantic Wolverstone speeding naked along his deck with the great flaming torch held high. Not until he had completed his work did they begin to suspect the truth, that he was lighting slow matches, and then one of their officers, rendered reckless by panic, ordered a boarding party on to the sloop. The order came too late. Wolverstone had seen his 6 fellows drop overboard after the grapnels were fixed, and then had sped himself to the starboard gunwale. Thence he flung his flaming torch down the nearest gaping scuttle into the hold, and thereupon dived overboard in his turn, to be picked up presently by the longboat from the Arabella. But before that happened the sloop was a thing of fire, from which explosions were hurling blazing combustibles aboard the Encarnacion, and long tongues of flame were licking out to consume the galleon, beating back those daring Spaniards who, too late, strove desperately to cut her adrift. And whilst the most formidable vessel of the Spanish fleet was thus being put out of action at the outset, Blood had sailed in to open fire upon the Salvador. First, athwart her hawse, he had loosed a broadside that had swept her decks with terrific effect. Then, going on and about, he had put a second broadside into her hull at short range. Leaving her thus half crippled, temporarily at least, and keeping to his course, he had bewildered the crew of the Infanta by a couple of shots from the chasers on his beak-head, then crashed alongside to grapple and board her, whilst Hagthorpe was doing the like by the San Felipe. And in all this time not a single shot had the Spaniards contrived to fire. So completely had they been taken by surprise, and so swift and paralysing had been Blood's stroke. Boarded now and faced by the cold steel of the buccaneers, neither the San Felipe nor the Infanta offered much resistance. The sight of their admiral in flames, and the Salvador drifting crippled from the action, had so utterly disheartened them that they accounted themselves vanquished and laid down their arms. If by a resolute stand the Salvador had encouraged the other 2 undamaged vessels to resistance, the Spaniards might well have retrieved the fortunes of the day. But it happened that the Salvador was handicapped in true Spanish fashion by being the treasure ship of the fleet, with plate on board to the value of some 50,000 pieces. Intent above all upon saving this from falling into the hands of the pirates, Don Miguel, who, with a remnant of his crew, had meanwhile transferred himself aboard her, headed her down towards Palomas and the fort that guarded the passage. This fort the admiral, in those days of waiting, had taken the precaution secretly to garrison and rearm. For the purpose he had stripped the fort of Cogero farther out on the Gulf, of its entire armament, which included some cannon royal of more than ordinary range and power. With no suspicion of this, Captain Blood gave chase, accompanied by the Infanta, which was manned now by a prize crew under the command of Iberville. The stern chasers of the Salvador desultorily returned the punishing fire of the pursuers, but such was the damage she herself sustained that presently, coming under the guns of the fort, she began to sink, and finally settled down in the shallows, with part of her hull above water. Thence, some in boats and some by swimming, the admiral got his crew ashore on Palomas as best he could. And then, just as Captain Blood accounted the victory won, and that his way out of that trap to the open sea beyond lay clear, the fort suddenly revealed its formidable and utterly unsuspected strength. With a roar, the cannons royal proclaimed themselves, and the Arabella staggered under a blow that smashed her bulwarks at the waist and scattered death and confusion among the seamen gathered there. Had not Pitt, her master, himself seized the whipstaff and put the helm hard over to swing her sharply off to starboard, she must have suffered still worse from the second volley that followed fast upon the first. Meanwhile it had fared even worse with the frailer Infanta. Although hit by one shot only, this had crushed her larboard timbers on the waterline, starting a leak that must presently have filled her, but for the prompt action of the experienced Iberville in ordering her larboard guns to be flung overboard. Thus lightened, and listing now to starboard, he fetched her about, and went staggering after the retreating Arabella, followed by the fire of the fort, which did them, however, little further damage. Out of range at last, they lay to, joined by the Elizabeth and the San Felipe, to consider their position. End of chapter 16.